Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 268 of our... I completely messed up the intro. I will go again. Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 268 of the podcast, and I've completely forgotten my intro.
Oh no.
What do I even say? This is an episode of the podcast. And then I say regular episode something. I'm completely confused. I'll just do some sort of... Okay. It's taken over 260 episodes. It's finally happened. Okay. Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 268 of our regular episodes, and I'm going to be your main host here, Morgan Airspeed Prime, and joining me on the podcast, as usual, is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we will have our usual mix of news and some episode reviews. Today we're going to be reviewing K211 Night of 1,000 Stars from Legend of Korra, and then 207 Zuko Alone from Avatar. But we'll start with the news, and of course there is a lot of news going on about Avatar. Yes, a lot of it, most of it, is Netflix Avatar, because we're under 3 weeks away until that actually hits on Netflix, so we get the full first season, so there's a bit of everything there with the trailer and so on. But there's been, again, as usual, some news about a little bit of everything else also. But we'll start with Netflix Avatar. I think we have to start there. The big thing that's happened since the last podcast is the full trailer did actually drop. The video is like, 2 minutes, like 29, I think, but when you take out all the kind of like ending bit with the Netflix stuff, it's more like 2 minutes exactly. And then when you factor in that not all of it's new footage, it's, under 2 minutes of new stuff. But we were waiting for this. They built up to it. We sort of almost got like a leaked thing in terms of like we knew it was coming a few days ahead of time. They officially announced it the day before, but it hit, and in general it seems like it was pretty well overall in terms of like the marketing right up until probably a few days ago was going perfectly, positively, and we'll get into sort of why that might have changed. But just to start off with, what were your thoughts just on the full trailer and finally getting that?
I'm glad they released it. I think it was really good to see it, to get a full scope of idea of what they're actually going to be shooting for with this show. And I think, for the most part, like you said, it was, at least initially, mostly well received. I think people were happy with the bending and happy with the general movements and, with the general flow of it. I mean, if you've seen Avatar, then, of course, you're going to know the general idea of what's going to happen in the trailer and what pieces and parts they're going to sort of pull together that are going to like highlight what happens in the first season. But there are some differences, which we already knew that there were going to be differences from the original animated show. So it was interesting to see at least what you could pull from the trailer, which like you said is 2 minutes or a bit under that, depending on the footage you're looking at. What you sort of could figure out, what you sort of knew, and sort of how it fit together in the full flow of things. So I'm glad that they finally got it out, and now it's just writing everything else till the actual release of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at least for me, like in terms of like the trailer, like, one of the big changes obviously is that this is where we got the confirmation that they've sort of incorporated 117 Northern Air Temple in with King of Omashu, and that the Mechanist and Teo are now in Omashu, and I'm guessing we're just going to avoid basically the Northern Air Temple and not do anything there, at least that we know of. That's probably the most obvious big change that we know of in terms of like, oh, that's a noticeable shift in terms of bringing characters like 12 episodes forward. What are your thoughts on something like that? That's arguably one of the biggest changes we've heard about so far.
Yeah, that definitely is one of the bigger ones. And I don't know if I feel that one got as much people upset as compared to some of the other things, but that definitely is a noticeable difference. And I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how those two, sort of overlap and bring them together. I mean, I don't know, we knew they were going to have to streamline some things. Like there's just, they're doing nowhere near as many episodes, even if they are, overall a longer runtime, right? Because of, the live episodic format. But it's, there's only so much you can fit into the space at a time and still have it being, somewhat sort of coherent. So I don't know. I think it's cool to get to see what their interpretation of the character is in live action. So I thought that was cool to see how they went about that way. But yeah, story wise, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out different. I'm curious about that. But I don't know. I think that I could see how that could sort of work considering all the stuff that was in Omashu that was more, I guess you could say, advanced or just worked well within that city itself. So it might work out well.
Hmm. Yeah, it is one of those ones where, like, as you say, there wasn't really that much of a negative reaction to this change versus the more intense reaction that there's been to some of the changes described in interviews. And it's this weird situation where, like, it seems like people are aware that there has to be changes going into 8 episodes from 20. And like you said, that there's the time technically to do almost everything exactly. But because it's 8 chunks, they're not just going to have like 2.5 episodes that are like separate things within one live action episode. So they're combining stuff together, and it's just interesting to see the way people are kind of interpreting specific changes in terms of what is okay, what isn't okay, overall. But just final thing on the trailer, I suppose, is was there a particular kind of standout shot or moment from the trailer for you?
Not overall. I think I was, like many people, I think I was really curious about the bending and how that would work for each individual element, and how, I don't know, how I just sort of adapted to seeing that in sort of the live action format, considering we have seen it before. So it's going to be interesting to see, how well that worked on sort of like, their production budget, which granted we know is, a bit higher than it normally would be for this type of show. I think that's what they were trying to get at us from like the get-go, but they're still working within the limits that they have. And I think for the most part, I was pretty happy with the elements and the bending and how they chose to display them. I think, for especially for a TV, most of it looked pretty sort of like on par of what I would hope it to be in terms of like, current technology and what they're able to do, and working within their sort of means. I think some of it might be interesting to see how it plays out in the actual story. I think probably the airbending is one I'm curious to see how that actually works in context of the actual show, but all the other ones, which are clearly usually more visual because the elements are visibly seen, of course, I think work pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it mostly looks good. I was a little worried about the earth bending because we only saw like a tiny bit of it and it looked very kind of pebbly. But then we got the like extra clip later on of Boomy with the full boulders, and it was like, okay, there we go, some solid earth. That seems good. And then one of the final shots of the trailer, the little bit of Zuko versus Katara, actually seemed pretty cool, pretty dynamic with the way it was shot, and just we saw a bit of kind of crazy water bending, kind of tendrils and stuff like that. So looks pretty good overall. I'd say for me, the standout thing was probably just the kind of like the Sozin reveal of like, hey, they're actually showing us a more sort of set piece moment of the kind of Erdnoma genocide sequence, and that like here's Sozin versus Gyatso. That's going to be a big thing in that opening episode, and I'm fascinated to see how that one goes, because I'm guessing we are getting Gyatso's death scene on screen. And how intense that's going to be in terms of like it's all about characters dying here, and they're in the interviews, the way they talked about it, it's like Gyatso's kind of being emphasized here as like his death, that Sozin's hand basically is what kind of starts things in a certain sense. But what were your thoughts getting to see some of that stuff, like a new thing? We always talk about how we want like canon material on the genocide, and here we're getting it in the live action to a certain degree.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I think, I saw a lot of people talking about like, the rating in the show and how that would be used to sort of show some things, not show some things. So I think that is, it's going to be something to see that, because we haven't really, like, we know some of it, and, there's some like other extra media, but for the most part, and most of the fandom, unless, they listen to you a lot, that sort of, idea of how that really came to be isn't quite known because show doesn't really go into that. That's not something that they focus on. So to actually get to see that in one form, even if it's not super animated canon or anything like that, it's still going to be something to behold, to see, and see how that affects people. Because I think for the most part, people who are really into the show, at least, that's already such like important moment there to see, and all we see is really like Aang's reaction to it, right? So to see it actually be displayed and then see his reaction to it will be something to behold, depending on how they go about displaying it.
Hmm. But yeah, after that, they pretty much continued the marketing since the trailer in terms of like releasing all these little small character kind of trailers, introducing like the four main cast members, and like Netflix had a small little event that had a little bit of extra footage, and then there's been two significant kind of interviews, one with EW, one with IGN, and that's where some of the maybe more issues have come out from. But I think it is important to kind of get into context that like 90% of the interview I think is fine, and hasn't really been, I suppose, overly talked about. I think people are happy with most of what's being said, but there's been a few comments from some of the actors I think initially, and then Albert Kim, the showrunner, in the IGN interview, that have mainly focused on changes and how they're doing some of this stuff that has definitely got people kind of thinking that, oh no, the worst is coming true. Is it going to be another live action disaster for Avatar type thing? And it's gotten maybe a little bit out of hand compared to like what the comments actually are. And it's a complicated one because some of the comments I think are kind of badly worded, and it's like, why did you say that? I don't think you should have said that. I think you probably should have just given a very, very, very kind of PR answer and kind of moved on instead of like half explaining it. And you're giving people a lot of kind of room to work with here to criticize you. But a lot of it is just stuff like, it seems like they are removing or heavily toning down the kind of early Sokka sexist arc that basically resolves itself in 104. That was one of the things that was talked about, that one of the actors mentioned, like, there are some iffy things in the original show and people didn't like that, and it was taken in one way, and then in the IGN interview they mentioned it again as like, we kind of have to guard against this sort of stuff, that almost that like Netflix or the showrunners were worried if they put that in that it would lead to a bad perception of Sokka. And there's a few other bits and pieces that happened, but it's stuff like that kind of happening in terms of, in my mind, it's vaguely talking about changes without going into details that's creating a lot of this. Whereas I think if you just let us discover this on our own or actually properly explained it, I think it would be a lot more understandable. But because there's these elements of kind of critique of the original show and that we have to like correct it, that's what's giving a bit of a bad vibe for some people out there. But what were your thoughts on the kind of the turn that we've seen in a way coming from some of these kind of headlines coming out of these interviews?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, obviously this show is being made, 20 years, whatever later, right? So obviously people's perceptions of things, the ideas that are like politically correct in the world are different than before. And, I think, the whole idea of Avatar, was, sort of being able to grow as a person and overcome, sort of these issues or qualities that you had, maybe when you were younger, or that you just, didn't have quite as, larger grasp of the world. And, that's always been something with Sokka. Like, I mean, he grew up in the South Pole and, now he's expanded his horizons to the rest of the world. So people, people really like that sort of growth in his characters, and all the characters grow. So, I definitely can see why people, would be sort of upset, that might be something that the show would, sort of try to tweak or streamline or, take in a sort of different way, which, again, we did know they were going to do stuff different regardless. Now, maybe changing his core character, depending on how far they actually take it, maybe that is too far. But I think, it's something that, trying to grasp at it from like an interview with the actors, is a hard thing to do. Maybe if it was like, the writer or the showrunner, maybe it been better. But even then, that's something that it's hard to see or hard to understand when you're not reading it in the sort of full context of it, which it may still be bad. It may still, not work out well, but I think jumping on it from the gun might be a bit too premature with it. But it's something that now people are going to be on the watch out for, right?
Yeah.
So there's no taking back on it. So it's just something we're going to have to see how it actually turns out.
Yeah, because I think that's the difference, is that we're going to go in now analyzing Sokka's early character arc, and we have these comments to kind of relate back to. Whereas if we'd just seen the show, we'd be like, oh, they toned this down, but they never really talked about it ahead of time. So it's just like a discussion of, does this work, does it not work, and there wouldn't be the sort of kind of vitriol kind of around it. But that they have to say stuff in interviews, I guess that's the other part of it. But some of the way they word it isn't helping themselves. Like, I think the comment about the Katara and the whole, like, we've like altered some of the like gender issues around like Katara's arc, and then he literally follows this up by saying like, but I don't want to get into that. And it's like, I don't think that's a good comment just to say that and leave it like that, because of the way people interpret it, especially on social media, that has been kind of just, that's gone all over the place. Like, people have interpreted that in the worst ways possible because it's such a vague comment overall. I do think there is a little bit of an element of like are we aware that they actually do have to make changes, and that like there is a sense of everyone's jumping to criticize every single change at this point. But hopefully, people will be a little bit more reasonable when it actually hits, and we can properly like have the discussions about the kind of pros and cons. But it's interesting because like initially I was kind of like I was happy in a way to see that there was a little bit of criticism coming in, because the marketing campaign had been going like so smoothly, it was so positive. But now it's gone like on the other end of things, and it's maybe a little bit kind of overblown. And I think a lot of people at this point are just like, I just want the show, just like stop speaking in interviews, maybe put out a few more clips, but just release the show is kind of where everyone's at right now. The discourse has just gotten a bit like, yeah, we're kind of tired of the drama, the pre-release drama almost. But I suppose just the final bit on this is, I suppose with under 3 weeks to go, where is your kind of anticipation level heading into the show?
I mean, I don't know. I'm still anticipating it, waiting to see how it turns out. I don't think my levels or anything like that have gone any higher per se in terms of like, chomping at the bit to sort of see it. But I'm glad that the trailers are well. It definitely gives me more, at least visually, more hope for it being, on par of what I might have imagined it might be in terms of like a live action show. And considering how Netflix has done with other live action shows, like the One Piece one that was well received, it definitely seems like maybe Netflix has the idea of, at least in some regards, how to do the adaptations sort of in a more meaningful way. Will it turn out that way in the end? I'm not really sure, but I'm definitely looking forward to how it comes out.
Yeah, like I think for me, I'm just anticipating the kind of big event that it's going to be for Avatar in general. I said it before, like a live action adaptation only interests me so much, but just the kind of event scenario in the fandom is exciting. And then I would say that like, I'm feeling relatively positive going in that like I'm expecting to at least think that this comes out like solid in the end. I think that's how it's shaping up for me so far. I'd be a little surprised if I come out like heavily disliking it, given that like I don't even really have like a hatred towards like the last Airbender movie. So like I'm expecting to be fine myself. I'm almost just a little bit worried about the broader reaction, just because I think it's kind of, you can see that the maybe more negative elements of the fan base are kind of showing themselves a little bit recently. But we'll see what happens overall, because I do just want to see how it works, because I like talking about the last Airbender movie in terms of like how they approached doing things with their restriction. Eager to see how it works here with like more room to work with, these kind of 8 episodes versus 20, but it's better. Anything's better than the like 90-minute movie that we basically got. So we'll see how it goes, because basically I'm assuming next podcast will be some sort of a discussion. We haven't really discussed how exactly we're going to cover it, but we might have to wait and watch some episodes before we address, like, are we just going to do a whole series discussion? Is it going to be across 2 episodes, 3 episodes? We don't know just yet. But we do have other news here. So I'll start with the kind of publishing date change news. Unfortunately, once again, the June and Iroh comic, The Bounty Hunter and the Tea Brewer, has been delayed again. It's now coming out August 6th. This is, again, pretty much a full, just over a month delay once again. No reason given. It just has been shifted back once more. Again, it was originally scheduled for May. Now it's August. Who's to say this is the last date? I don't understand this. I thought we were past these super regular date changes. Don't know what to say at this point. This is probably like 3 or 4 podcasts in a row we've discussed the date change for this book. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, like we've been talking about it so much that it really seems odd that it's having these sort of switches, and I don't know. I don't know. I would like, it'd be nice if they would say something on it, but that's not really how they do things.
Yeah, because like I'd like to know, like, is it just publishing logistics, like getting it printed on time and all that sort of stuff that has been the problems in the past, or are they actually moving this in relation to like marketing kind of stuff, like they wanted at this time for a reason to coincide with other stuff that's coming out? That's the kind of confusing part of it that we just don't know. Because on the other side of things, we might have got a piece of news today that's suggesting a date change in the opposite direction, which pretty much never happens. It seems like the Roku novel, The Reckoning of Roku, may have switched back to its original July 23rd date, having for the last while been listed as August 20th. So Abrams Books, so the publisher's own website, Amazon.com, and Barnes & Noble, so 3 really big places that have this book, literally overnight, effectively have switched the date of this book back to the original one. Now, there's some weirdness around this because obviously not every place has changed the date. Like audiobook and like the audio CD version still say August, but it's still early in the month in terms of like, you know, getting solicitations for publishers for the month. So I'm assuming it's a kind of change in progress. So I don't really know what it means in terms of like, is this confirmed? Is it a mistake with these 3 websites? Doesn't often happen, especially with the main publisher mistakenly putting up a date change. So we'll see what happens here. Any thoughts on this one? A positive date change potentially?
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. I mean, I hope it stays that way and it goes back to the original date. But yeah, that's definitely a curious one.
Yeah, the other factor in this is that the paperback version of The Rise of Kyoshi is finally coming out after all these years. And it's also coming out on July 23rd. So I don't know if that's part of why there's this July 23rd kind of date, maybe confusion, or is that a purposeful thing that they want the new book in hardcover out on the same date as the original book in like softcover, basically. Is that part of their strategy or not? Not really sure, but something to keep an eye out for, because it has been a tradition that the Avatar novels release in July. Maybe they've worked to make it happen. Maybe they've moved another book around to keep this kind of tradition going, perhaps. We have to wait and see, because we're still waiting for the cover reveal for Reckoning of Roku. Maybe that happens this month. It definitely is possible, just because they've been doing the news about this book a little bit earlier than usual. So we'll see what happens. Then we'll move on to the podcast. So obviously the Braving the Elements podcast returned. The first episode was a Mike and Brian interview, and that kind of dropped just shortly before it launched. And it came out, and I think most people in general were, I think, in terms of like the hardcore fandom, pretty disappointed in it because multiple reasons. One, their initial comment about, hey, what are you working on? They gave the most kind of bland kind of response that felt like the exact same thing they've said in every single podcast appearance they've ever been on. They didn't really say too much. I'd say that the only thing to latch onto is that Brian, I think, once again said that they are working on multiple things at once. And I think from the timing of this, it was post the firings or the people being let go at Avatar Studios, based on when this was recorded. I think it was shortly after that. That might explain their slightly kind of negative kind of almost appearance when giving those responses. But working on multiple things at the same time didn't allude to any of the stuff that we already know or anything like that. And like, the podcast is fine. It's always nice to hear Mike and Brian talk about things, but there was nothing super interesting, I felt, in the rest of the podcast. Then there was the other element of, like, for this new season of the podcast, there's this like Apple exclusive kind of bonus episodes, which does appear to just be they cut off 13 minutes of their or so of their recording and just put it on a bonus feed that you have to pay for, and it's exclusive to Apple, which hasn't gone down like super well, especially because there was a kind of interesting discussion point on the bonus podcast, the first one, about like Brian getting a little bit technical on bloodbending and mentioning like chi fields and stuff like that. But your thoughts overall on the Mike and Brian interview on the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can understand from people that were really hoping there was going to be something in there, looking for something, but I don't know. I didn't really think there was going to be anything in it as far as like, behind the scenes show or like production notes or like, where they are in the timeline of things. Like, everything they've done so far has been, just we're working on it and that it takes time and, it's a process and, trust the process, etc., stuff like that. So, I mean, they try to play it up sort of as like a joke in the podcast or anything like that. But like, that's just how they are in terms of that sort of stuff. So I don't know. I'm not surprised that we didn't hear anything. Like, I'm still not expecting to hear anything until like, they're ready to release a trailer or something like that. Like, I mean, it's just something that they've been doing so far, and every once in a while they'll say, something or whatever. But I think until they're ready to show something, we're not going to get anything out of them. So I don't know. Maybe I already had too low expectations, so I wasn't disappointed when they didn't really say anything. So that's just sort of my quick take on that. And yeah, it is too bad that there is more stuff that is sort of, behind a paywall, but that's just sort of how things go now in terms of media and everything, stuff like that. So unfortunately, that's not much surprising either.
Yeah. The podcast hype, I think, very much died down after the initial episode in terms of just like, oh yeah, we know what the podcast is, we know what it isn't. I appreciate that Janet and Dante at least ask them the question, but it is kind of a bit of a, we have to ask this question. The fans will give out to us if we don't ask you this question for being on the podcast. But yeah, they're not willing to say anything right now, or maybe they can't say anything. We don't know what the situation is, but like, it's just frustrating because like Brian even like mentioned that like, oh yeah, the original show took like 3 years to make, and I'm just kind of like, 3 years of Avatar Studios, basically. What's going on here? But we'll see what happens with that. Next piece of news, Avatar in Concert has started. We have had the first 2 showings of Avatar in Concert. The premiere was in London, and then they did the second one in Paris, in France. Yeah, there was some cool stuff coming out of this. Brian attended both of the first 2 showings and gave, I think, a speech at the start of both of them. Of course, Jeremy Zuckerman was there, of course, also. And everything has pointed to the fact that both of these have gone down super, super well. Everyone who's attended really likes it. It's like 2.5 hours of music. It does cover all 3 books. And it seems like it's a really, really good experience. So much so that basically the day after the London showing, they made a big announcement that the Avatar in Concert is expanding to be a giant 100+ city tour that's going to be detailed later on in the year. So we already have a decent amount of showings up on the website at the moment, but it's going to be heavily expanded into more kind of European places, North America and Asia Pacific, I think was what they specified here. So everything going well with this. Not too much negativity here. Maybe the merch is a little bit bland, but that's about the worst criticism. But what are your thoughts on Avatar in Concert's kind of debut and expansion?
Yeah, no, I'm glad it's doing well, and everything that I've seen from it, like you said, like from people who've been there and have talked about it, it seems like it was a great experience, and I guess it was is doing well enough that they can expand it as much as they want to, because that definitely feels like a lot of cities. I'm not really sure like how what's the average for like concerts and there's sort of tours in cities or even normal sort of music events, but that sounds like a lot to me, even if it's around the whole world and stuff like that. So definitely feels like sort of the initial sort of upset that people had that it wasn't really going to be in like a place near them. It's definitely seems like it's going to have a better chance of being closer to people now than it was before. We'll see how their sort of like distribution of World Tour actually goes, because I know sometimes that can be a bit sort of iffy, and World Tour can only mean certain places and not other places. But hopefully Avatar in Concert doesn't go that sort of route as other concerts tend to do. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. I still have my tickets for here, not in New York, so definitely something to look forward to.
Yeah, because that's the situation that we're in now. Is that, yeah, there's going to be another London showing on February 10th, and then like 2 weeks after that they start the a kind of American kind of leg of the initial tour. Three San Francisco showings, and then two in New York. Then they go to Germany, Netherlands for two, back to Germany, and then an Australian showing. So it'll be interesting to see if they add more in between here, because there's already on the list like a pretty big gap between April 30th and June 15th. Will they fill in any of that, or as they say, is it just going to be they announce stuff starting from September in many cities? We'll see how it goes. So yeah, the really positive here. The music just in a couple of months has gone from being a thing where just like, hey, did they remember this exists, to they're all in on the music. Will be interesting to see when we hear about the book 2 soundtrack, like full release, and what the plan is there, how quickly those releases are actually going to happen. But very positive stuff here for a big Avatar Studios event. Like just seeing people take pictures, and like one of them being that like they have the Avatar Studios logo on like an event that is actually happening is like, it's real. And so that's a positive. Last couple of pieces of news. Avatar Legends RPG, they announced their next book. So they had a bit of a teaser kind of campaign here, teasing that it's like related to Iroh and T in some way. Most people had no clue what on earth was going on with this. We got confirmation it was not the Spirit World book. That's still being worked on, and it will come out eventually. This is a new book. This is the Uncle Iroh's Adventure Guide. So this is a similar book to the Wan Shi Tong Adventure Guide from the original release. So what this is made up of is basically it's 5 adventures, one from each of the 5 eras that are in the game currently. But it's an interlinked group of 5 adventures as like a cross-generational story if you want to play it that way, because it seems like each of the adventures is going to be set or reference this new location that they're introducing here, Jasmine Island, the origin of Jasmine Tea, I guess, in the Avatar universe. And there's some sort of they're going to go full into like the lore and history of this island and what it's about in all the different eras, and introduce the mechanic of how you go about kind of playing in one era and then moving on to maybe the same characters but older, I guess, or a different group of characters that are related to the previous group. That'll be an interesting one to see how they go about explaining it. But there's going to be that. There's going to be a bunch more legend NPCs, a few more playbooks for those who play the game. But I think most people are excited about the lore of this new location, obviously, and that they're highlighting like Iroh's kind of guiding you through it in a way. But also that one of the legend NPCs is going to be Liu Ten. So we're going to get like some sort of a bio about Liu Ten. They also, in one of I think the Polygon interview, mentioned that there's going to be write-ups about Princess Zaysan, as well as Kondro, who obviously is who she's engaged to, which is interesting because Zaysan, we already have a legend NPC for Chondro we don't, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily what they're talking about here. So the new information here, I'm kind of sold just on there just being Liu 10, but I'm interested to see who else they pick here, because there's probably going to be at least 4 or 5 legend NPCs. They seem to also be alluding to the fact that we'll get like a bio for like Aang era Iroh, whereas the one we have currently is General Iroh. So that's interesting. But what are your thoughts on this? A kind of surprise new book for the RPG.
Yeah, I don't think I expected them to do this type of book story, but I mean, Uncle Iroh is super popular as a character, so I guess if you had to pick someone to make an additional sort of story adventure guide about, I think this is a good one to go for. I mean, I think, if they ever did like a direct story for Iroh, that would of course also be like super awesome, and everybody would be all about that. So this is like, the next best thing, I think, especially if you're into the game and you want to play it and have more stories to go through and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think it's cool that they're still going with the Avatar Legends role playing game. I think it's something that I don't think we might necessarily thought would do that well or would have that much draw. But it definitely has its place, and people are really seem to be enjoying it if they're able to keep making all this content for it. So I say more for it.
Yeah, I think within the context of like, what it is, like an RPG game, a little bit of sort of like a niche piece of merchandise, like it has done like exceptionally well with the amount it made on Kickstarter, and obviously the popularity of the game and a lot of the other stuff that they have going on with, like, I think a lot of those playthroughs with actors have done really well for them as well. So I think it's a big thing, and that's why we're getting like an extra surprise book. The Spirit World book is still being worked on, and I'm guessing there are plans for probably more after that, because I think people want more eras, like Yang Chen era, Wan era, and so on. And I'm guessing they probably will move to do that and have this here for like when we get the new content and they expand further on other eras. Like, I'm guessing there'll be some sort of a tie-in maybe to the new content in terms of like, here's adult Aang era type stuff. That would be cool when we finally start to see that type of stuff. But yeah, the final details on this are that this will go up for pre-order on February 12th, and apparently there will be some sort of a pre-order limited time offer if you like kind of pre-order immediately. Not sure exactly what that's going to be. The last time they did it with the kind of Republic City book, it was that you could get the GM screen for free. So we'll see what they do here. It might be like some extra kind of dice, like different colored dice that have like a logo on it, or maybe it's just like a good price at launch. Who knows what exactly they're going to do, because they obviously haven't really teased that much like extra content. Maybe there's like an extra adventure you get if you pre-order early. We'll have to wait and see on that, but it says it's scheduled to be released in fall 2024. No details about how they're doing the digital versus physical split, whereas they always give us the digital one basically as soon as the book is done. I'm assuming it's fall for the physical release, but any thoughts on the kind of like those kind of like order details?
Nah, I mean, I think, if it's worth the while, I think people are definitely going to sort of buy into it. So I don't know. I think it's cool that they're at least giving you that option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we'll see in the coming months what they do about the Spirit World book. Because I'm a little bit kind of disappointed, because I was looking forward to that stuff and spirit lore that we were probably going to get, but this seems interesting as well. Final piece of news is kind of 2 little bits and pieces kind of added together. Basically, it's about Avatar Studios' like marketing kind of hints. It's the idea that it does seem like somewhere in the background that there is a plan to build up Avatar ahead of its kind of return in 2025. So the first stage of this comes from, I think Nick Alive were the ones who found this. It obviously links back to this Toy World magazine for January 2024, which is like a toy industry kind of publication. They have an interview with one of the kind of high-ups at Paramount Consumer Products, And in this, obviously, most of it's a discussion about just in general how things were. It's not a specific Avatar interview. But the question comes up, looking to the year ahead, 2024, what do you expect to be the standout moments for Paramount in terms of consumer products? The answer is that it's going to be an exciting year. We're doubling down on our biggest franchises, Paw Patrol and TMNT, and setting the stage for two long-awaited reinventions, the cult classic Avatar The Last Airbender and the most beloved preschool heroine of all time, Dora the Explorer. And then they go on to talk about, like, you know, Garfield's in there as well, and some other stuff. But the highlight here, obviously, is that they give quite heavy praise to how well Paw Patrol and TMNT did for them in 2023, and that they view Avatar and Dora as being like 3 and 4 on their kind of list in terms of their kids franchises that they think will do good in terms of selling merchandise, basically. And if you've been paying attention, there's not really a lot of Avatar merchandise kind of on the go at the moment. There's been a little bit of a slowdown in the last year or two, and it seems like they're waiting to build up again, because Paramount, it's felt like there's been a bit of a disconnect where, like, most of the merch that's come out recently has been like almost like pre-Avatar Studios deals, just kind of going about their business, that Avatar Studios hasn't really, you know, put the confidence behind the merch, and that a lot of it is kind of niche stuff that you can only get in like specialty stores or you have to order online. My assumption with the way that this is being talked about is that they are talking about stuff that you will see in stores. In the same way that there's a new TMNT toy line in stores right now, Paw Patrol stuff is in toy stores. They're saying that Avatar stuff will be there alongside Dora as well. And that's kind of positive because we haven't seen that in a very, very long time. And it basically goes back to the early Avatar toy line, the last time it really happened, because Korra got basically nothing. It's a small quote, this one, but I think it's somewhat meaningful that we have this here, that like, okay, something will happen in relation to merchandise with Avatar this year that will be somewhat big ahead of next year. That's a positive. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's, such a small mention, but I guess it does, give that there is, like you said, there's a larger plan that's in place, and we know the show is coming. We just know it's going to take time, right? So I think at least it seems like they're trying to sort of like have stuff sort of coincide with it rather than sort of be too ahead of things, which I think is what they've done recently. Again, is just had too much stuff, too much sort of licensing out there, without anything really sort of to back it. Now, of course, there is the live action show, so we'll see if they try to sort of take some of that sort of energy and use it for their own show in some form or fashion. No, I wouldn't be surprised if they try to use something that way, but their actual production is still a bit more on the ways out there. So I don't know if we're really going to see anything that important soon.
Yeah, because this ties into Netflix as well, obviously, because Avatar is going to be popular enough that even though people are watching live action Avatar, it will increase interest in the cartoon, and obviously people will want merch. And most of the merch lines, in terms of really notable stuff, is like wave ones of a lot of that stuff came out like 2-3 years ago. It's not as available. Like, not that many places probably have that stuff in stock. So there has to be some sort of a new line, I'm guessing, that has Aang, Katara, Sokka in there, that they hope to sort of coincide with Netflix, and then it's the same line, it's the same franchise. You can put your new Avatar Studios stuff into this toy line that is already established in stores. I'm guessing that's part of the plan. But it links in then to this random find. Like, this is a really obscure kind of little bit. On the Avatar The Last Airbender Heart of a Hero book, Edelweiss page listing, in the section about marketing plans and key selling points, it just randomly has this section: consumer products and retail development. The first 2 points are just about stuff that happened at the end of last year, but then the last 2 are kind of interesting. So the third point is, in Q1 of 2024, when Netflix releases its live action Avatar series, retailers will leverage their core and classic products which fit right into the plotline of the Netflix series. And then the final point is obviously stuff that we haven't experienced yet. In Q2 and Q3 of 2024, an In Your Element campaign will leverage in-world activations and social assets that will help to engage core Avatar fans. So this is weird because it's like, is that... I don't think that's the publisher, Little Brown Books, having this Avatar campaign. I'm assuming that this is like related to Avatar Studios officially overall. Just because they mention in the second point is about the World Animal Day, which was mainly like Avatar Generations, I think, that did that. I think the official account did it a little bit, but they were doing stuff like, so it's related to the overall franchise as well. But what are your thoughts on this random little discovery of like marketing plans for Avatar in 2024?
Yeah, that's very curious to hear that and how they're sort of phrasing that going forward. Because I don't know, that feels like it's more of a ramp up to things, but it doesn't really feel like, there's still anything behind it really, and things are still sort of, not coming out at, a pace that we would, gather that would, need that sort of attention and stuff like that. So I don't know. That feels like a conflict there from what we actually see happening, but maybe this is something just behind closed doors that we're just not privy to.
Yeah, because like if you link it all together, it's like, okay, in 3 weeks we'll get Netflix Avatar. Avatar's going to be super popular again, and people are going to like want merch and to watch the shows again. So retailers, obviously, I'm guessing what they say there is they're going to highlight the stuff that they have in stock already for Avatar, because it doesn't seem like there's maybe a ton of new stuff coming out in the coming months necessarily. So they're just going with the idea that the Netflix show will sell general Avatar merchandise, and then the In Your Element campaign is going to engage core Avatar fans. This is obviously marketing lingo, like leverage in-world activations. Like, is that like create new Avatar fans, basically? I'm not really sure what that necessarily means. But they'll have social media assets, I guess. And what are they promoting at that point? Because it doesn't really feel like Paramount's going to necessarily be like directly being like Netflix Avatar hype. They're going to want to promote their own stuff. So it kind of does feel like this is almost suggesting they are actually going to talk about Avatar Studios at some point, like in the middle of this year, in a somewhat big way, because like they have the website already, but there's nothing really on it. If they were to announce like their kind of slate of first projects, and it all works together, like you can sort of see how this can come together. But like, I don't know if this In Your Element campaign will work unless it's alongside like big kind of reveal of new animated Avatar with visuals and stuff like that. Like they start the hype campaign in like the middle to the end of 2024. Because it's the same with the merchandise. Like I don't think that does as well unless it's really heavily out there that Avatar is coming back in animation, which I don't think that's as well known as maybe you would overall think. But just your final thoughts on this.
Yeah. I think I agree with that. I don't think it's really in, like, we're talking about it a lot, but we're the ones that are sort of like following it as it happens and looking at sort of these reports that a normal person wouldn't necessarily even care to bother with, like, unless they're, following someone like you or any of the other sort of channels or stuff like that, or, social media places. I don't feel like that's a larger thing that's exposed out there. Maybe it will be after the live action show comes out. So maybe they're banking more on that sort of, sort of explosion of activity in terms of the fandom and it being sort of in people's social consciousness, in the current times. But again, after that comes out and, says they are dumping it all at once, as far as we know, that's only going to have so much, sort of like staying power. So I don't know the longevity of that hype, how long it will actually go for like the average day person.
Yeah, like that is the big thing of like, if they're like Netflix One Piece, it felt like it had like maybe 3 weeks to a month maybe where it was like really like out there, and it's kind of just been kind of silent a little bit since then, because like they had to quickly announce like, yeah, we're confirming everything else with this, like we're doing more. I assume the same will probably happen here because, despite some of the negativity, I think it probably will. There's enough confidence behind it. I'm guessing it's probably in this situation where it's like basically on the verge of getting the confirmation for more, but they just are slightly worried that it will be just panned, maybe. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's been all the news. Really, we're just in the countdown to Netflix Avatar at this point. A lot of like other releases, as we talked about, like all the new stuff is basically second half of the year. So it's Netflix Avatar and news for later in the year. Hopefully, Avatar Studios says something. That's kind of where we're at. But we'll jump into the reviews, and we'll start with the Korra episode that we have for today, and that is K211 Night of 1,000 Stars. So, my overall thoughts on this one are that I really like this episode. I had a lot of fun watching this earlier on today, and especially because this is in a way like the finale to some of the smaller plot points in Book 2, some of the more criticized ones that aren't like the big stuff. But I think it's really well done. Like Bolin, I think is fantastic in this episode. Mako gets his big moment. The action scenes that we get in like all sides of the episode, I think are very strong. And because it's part of a big like 4-part finale, I think they get to the point where with what's happened to Jinora at the start, the threat at the end because Raiko won't help, the stakes feel very, very high. My only criticism would be sort of some of the relationship drama stuff that kind of comes out at the end when the group comes back together, but it's a small scene in the grand scheme of the episode. Otherwise, it's like I just think a ton of fun the whole episode, and I'm often just surprised with these Book 2 episodes. I'm like, wait, people don't like this one or some of these plots. This is pretty good. But your overall thoughts on Night of 1,000 Stars?
Yeah, no, I get that. I think it's a very fun, like, sort of streamlined episode, and I think, with it being on the back half of the season, it just sort of flows together very well because, we already have gone through sort of like a lot of the sort of conflicts and know a lot of the sort of issues that are up. That have been coming up, throughout the whole sort of season here. So this is, like you said, it's really just sort of things coming to a head and sort of seeing sort of the resolution of things. There's still, the big sort of looming overall threat going on, and we actually get to see a bit of play for that when we get to sort of where Unalaq is. But, for the most part, it's just sort of, this happens and there's a reaction to it, then another thing happens and a reaction happens to it, and despite some things sort of being perilous in various different situations, it's enjoyable to watch and see how it all plays out at the end of it.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose we'll start with the kind of smallest part of the episode, in that it's only like 2 or 3 scenes. That is the Southerners, led by Tonrock, attack basically the Northerners to try and take back the city. So this is the conflict that is going on. Again, the backdrop to this is just that like Unalaq is holding the city basically just for the portal. That's all he really cares about. He's just trying to like guarantee that now that they're open, that no one can get in and stop this from happening, because as we learned from the last episode, if the portals are closed, we'll avoid the actual fight between Rava and Vatu. So that's the only way to stop this like preemptively, and that's why Unalaq's in full on like defense mode. That's why he's out here on the battlefield when his brother attacks. And yeah, we see the Southerners are following Tonrock. He leads the attack down. There is in the middle of the episode, a thing that makes you think the fight between them is going to happen earlier, but it's more of just Unalaq has entered the battlefield, and then he spots him later on during the battle and makes a beeline for him, and it's the big fight between the brothers that we build up to. Unalaq even says to Eska and Desna, let me fight him one-on-one. And it's a really amazing waterbending fight where you see the differences in style, but also sort of like the differences in like class as well. That Unalaq is ultimately one of the best waterbenders in the entire series. Like, that has to be acknowledged here. And he is stronger, kind of more subtle in his bending than his more kind of brute force style brother. I love a lot of the action here. I love the contrast in styles between the brothers, and I like the brutality and the emotion kind of on display here as well, because Tonrock's been betrayed. He's found out about this by his brother, and Unalaq just doesn't really care about this, and just like they frame the kind of shattering him in the ice as this kind of almost death scene, because it just completely like injures him. Like he comes out of that, and there is Tonrock's like fully damaged like character model. It's like some of the worst kind of injuries we've kind of seen in a way in the show. But what are your thoughts on this plot point? It's a small part of the episode, but they make sure to emphasize the battle of the brothers.
Yeah, no, I think the battle is very important to see sort of the conclusion of their sort of conflict that they've had with each other that has been going on, for all these years, and especially, throughout this season, just to sort of see sort of, understanding of where they're at, sort of just laying it all sort of out there. And yeah, the fight is, very sort of brutal. You can clearly see what's going on, and I think you get the idea that they're both, very sort of skilled, especially being, in their positions or former positions that they used to have. So, they're more of the, the top or echelon of benders, but you definitely can see, Unalaq, even though you do see him, sort of have the, exert some energy by the end of the battle here, but he definitely does have sort of, the overall better skills as a waterbender, at least in terms of this fight. And, I would suspect that they, both know each other pretty well in terms of, their sort of bending skills, and definitely seems like that played towards Unalaq's sort of advantage here in terms of the battle. But yeah, it definitely feels like it's, very sort of like emotional driven, considering everything that's sort of happened in the past between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like at the very least, it's like Tonrock made Unalaq sweat, because there's that shot like when the fight just ends and they cut to Unalaq and he's like, that was close. But it's also interesting, like the kind of finishing move that like Tonrock was going for was like he just went for the full-on physical punch. Like usually his finishing move would be what he I think nearly does to Zahir, the kind of like ice kind of fist dagger thing, that would add a little bit of length. But he actually just goes to try and like physically punch him, and I'm kind of wondering, like, is that part of the ultimately, like, Tonrock was never going to like kill his brother here, that he still cares about him, as we find out in the kind of coming episodes, even though it's not kind of like responded to in reverse. Was that kind of factored in here, that like Tonrock kind of wanted to knock some sense into his brother, whereas Unalaq just wanted to get his brother out of the way? But I don't know. What were your thoughts on that? Just like the move Tonrock was going for there when he charged through all Unalaq's attacks.
Yeah, I wonder if it's part of that, or if it's just sort of, the state of being in that sort of emotional fight that sort of, didn't lead him to sort of, fight with like the perfect sort of clarity of mind, or having, sort of the normal sort of like tactical sort of prowess that, we would see that he would sort of, normally have, because he's, he is a direct sort of, waterbender, at least as far as, we've seen before. So, a lot of his moves sort of make sort of sense in that regard, but it definitely feels like he was going very sort of bullish in this sort of fight, in this sort of endeavor here, which, I don't know, maybe there would have been some other sort of roundabout way that would have been more, conducive to this actual sort of fight here. But I don't know. I think, in terms of like who has more sort of compassion for the other, I definitely would say that Tonrock probably has more of that. So even if he wasn't sort of like fully conscious of it, there might have been some subconscious, sort of thoughts there in terms of his actual sort of fighting moves.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we'll move into the kind of main body of the episode, because obviously this is Bolin's episode kind of primarily. So we start out with Bolin visits Mako in jail. He's heading out to the kind of showing of the finale of Nuktuk. They're doing a really big kind of red carpet event. And he makes some kind of like jabs at the sort of change in situation for the two of them, that like Bolin is a celebrity, Mako's in jail. Mako does try to sort of argue his innocence, and kind of as Bolin goes to leave, Mako just tries to make it really clear that, hey, keep your eyes open. I'm not crazy. I think something's going to happen at the premiere. And it kind of ends on this kind of slightly bad terms, where like Bolin doesn't kind of maybe fully believe Mako, but Mako gets through to him a little bit, as we see in Bolin's kind of reaction during the whole premiere. Um, it's an interesting scene just to kind of highlight kind of the fractures that have kind of happened in their relationship over the course of the season, in terms of them each kind of respecting each other or not respecting each other at various points. But I think it pays off pretty well over the course of the episode. But what are your thoughts on this opening scene in the jail cell?
Yeah, no, you definitely see sort of the strain of the relationship for the past, sort of period of time here, and how well, Bolin being in sort of like the upper echelons of society, or at least that's what he considers himself to be now, with his sort of rise to stardom, and how famous he's become, almost sort of like overnight, basically, right? So definitely sees sort of that sort of contrast, and everything between the two of them. And yeah, it definitely does feel like, Bowen's always, he says a couple times like, oh, you're going for like the insanity plea and everything like that, which I don't know, that that's just sort of Bowen's way of sort of like brushing off the sort of the situation here. But yeah, definitely, tables have turned in terms of who's doing better in life.
And it gets brought up that Asami kind of like couldn't bring herself to visit Mako in jail. I suppose subtly playing into the idea of like her father's also in jail now. Her, at this point, I guess, boyfriend technically is also in jail. That whole idea. But anyway, we move on to the kind of red carpet entrances here. Bolin goes in with Ginger, because of course they're co-stars, and because I guess this is the first time they're properly seeing this kind of more celebrity angle, everyone just assumes that because they're a couple on screen, they're also a couple off screen. And Bolin is just like, hey, we're in a relationship. Isn't that true? And Ginger's just like, no, because she sort of gets, I suppose, the early entertainment industry. Bolin doesn't. And so there's some confusion there. But that situation. We then see Raiko and his wife, Buttercup Raiko, arrive at the premiere, brought in by Varric, of course, and this is like the key thing, that like Raiko being here is key to Varric's plan, and he just tries to highlight and kind of just put pressure on Raiko of like, Raiko knows he's going to see basically a propaganda movie, but Varric is like, no, there'll be a bit more than that, and there's just kind of more being talked about here than they're necessarily kind of letting on. But your thoughts on the red carpet sequence?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's interesting to see how that sort of plays out in the Avatar world, and this sort of being sort of, as far as we could tell, sort of like the first real sort of like instance of this sort of fame and stardom. I mean, Bolin did have some fame from, being a pro bender and stuff like that, but doesn't feel like it was quite at this sort of level. So it's definitely, curious to see how that sort of plays out in this sort of world, and how, sort of they, like you mentioned, how they think they're couples, but they're not really a couple there. And Bolin might be, feeding a bit too much into his own sort of fame here, which is just sort of, his character overall sort of being, a little bit sort of gullible, a little bit too easygoing at times. So, sort of plays into that, but you definitely can see President Raiko is definitely more astute with the situation going on, but he's, even he's not fully aware of how much this can be sort of like politically influence his sort of like current sort of campaign and how he's doing things.
Mm-hmm. Varric, as they get inside, Varric kind of intros the mover and talks about, of course, what is happening in the south, and really puts pressure on Raiko in the speech without kind of directly mentioning him to act, just saying that like someone needs to do something, and it's clear that Raiko is the one who can do something like that. He does also in the middle of this kind of mention that like, oh, I took like a knucklehead earthbender and made them a star. And as we go into like the next scene, this is where I think you realize like Bolin is like, oh, this group of people who I think are like my new friends, it's not the same as like my actual friends, and he misses Mako kind of being there. Only Asami of his actual friends are actually there, and he kind of realizes that like, oh yeah, Ginger just sees him as like a co-star, Varric just kind of views him as like someone he can turn into a star, and that the reality of his situation is that like he's famous, but like he's kind of gone in a direction that is like away from his friends, and that gets discussed a little bit later on. I like some of that kind of subtle moments here, because Bolin goes from being all in on I'm a star to shortly into the mover he's just like, oh, I it's not the same without everyone else here. But what are your thoughts on this opening sequence of the? We see a bit of the mover as well here, as well as this other stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a cool way to sort of intro sort of the last sort of mover in this series that they have here, and Varric sort of getting his own sort of political sort of agenda, his sort of back end sort of dealings out there and open in sort of somewhat subtle ways, but still pretty obvious when he's asking for like a real life hero to sort of help the situation going on, and you can see Raiko react to it a little bit here. So it's definitely, this is sort of, you can sort of see, I guess, sort of the seams and what's sort of happening here without it being completely apparent yet. I mean, us as the viewer, we know what's sort of going on, but now we can see that our characters here are sort of starting to realize that things are not quite as what they sort of seem. So when it does finally get sort of revealed, it's like, oh yeah, this was sort of happening all along, and I just sort of didn't want to see it for what it really was.
We then get a quick scene where we see like some, I suppose, southern assailants sneaking up by boat, entering the arena, going in through the window, and they take out Detective Liu and Gon and stick them in a locker. So they've kind of snuck their way in, and they're of course going after the president. This is followed by Bolin kind of heading out at a point to think about things, and Asami follows him out, and he just talks about kind of what I alluded to earlier on, like missing the team not being there, Korra not being there, Mako, even Asami being mostly busy dealing with like her business stuff with Future Industries, that things have really changed from the more kind of simple times when like Team Avatar could just be Team Avatar doing things. Asami does agree with this, but she then heads back in, and just before Bolin heads back in, he does notice the boat kind of parked outside that wasn't kind of not meant to be there, and he goes to investigate. He finds Liu and Gon tied up, and they reveal that yes, the assailants are going after the president. So this is what kicks off the action kind of part of the scene here. So I like this, Liu and Gon being kind of useless as usual, some kind of funny and slightly kind of disgusting scenes with them and like the cakes, and then I like the kind of slightly emotional reflecting on what's happened to the team this season, which definitely relates to like the start of the season. Like we were introed at the start of the season to all the characters as doing their own separate things, and it's the same kind of at this point before they come back together here. But what are your thoughts on these scenes?
Yeah, I think it does, it takes a beat to sort of pause and sort of, allow us and Bolin to sort of, I guess, sort of collect your thoughts on sort of the current state of, Team Avatar, right? Because they definitely have been, on their own doing this sort of things, and I guess they're also just sort of showing that's just sort of part of them sort of growing up and sort of going their own sort of ways, but there's still some things that they have to do together, which I think is cool that we get to see that by the end of the episode here. But yeah, this definitely is sort of I guess you could say it's like the calm before, like you just said, the real action of the episode actually starts here, because you definitely feel like you're noticing things are afoot and they're just sort of all building up at this moment, right?
Mm-hmm. And then yeah, we get straight into the action scene. So we immediately cut to Raiko and Buttercup are taken by the assailants. Bolin immediately arrives on the scene here, jumps right into action. He like earth bends them kind of out onto the arena floor, and we get this. In my mind, like it's an incredible action scene that's really clever, where we see like that real life action starts at the exact same point as like the action in the movers is happening, and it all lines up like perfectly. Of Nuktuk has his big moment in the mover as Bolin gets to be incredible in real life and kind of have this kind of real pro bending match against these waterbenders here. And it's just a bunch of fun scenes. Like he's in his kind of like tight suit, but he gets down, flexes his muscles, rips off the sleeves, and just starts doing like his best pro bending work that we've kind of ever seen here, because he can do anything he wants. There's no rules here, so he uses all the discs that he wants, and he does 3-on-1 take down these waterbenders. And Shiro Shinobi starts to commentate on it. Ginger suddenly is just takes an actual interest in Bolin at this point, as he has the crowd completely behind him. Like he the thing with like Bolin is that like he's already liked by Republic City because like he lives there. He's a hometown player here, and they like him now as a celebrity, and now he's also a hero as well. So everything goes right for him here. He takes out the last attacker and basically threatens him to admit that yes, Varric was the one who sent him. Lin immediately is there to arrest Varric, and Bolin gets this huge moment where he's just celebrated for on-screen work, off-screen work, and it's just like, what a moment! Like his amazing moment for season 2. But yeah, that's the action set piece of the episode. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I thought this was great. It's it's always cool to see Bolin in sort of action here, and this is, like you said, this is like peak Bolin in terms of his abilities. Like he's completely 100% on it. Like that one sort of pro bending match where he was like completely on top of his game and everything before things sort of fall apart with their sort of team there. So it's definitely cool to get to see him use the disc without any sort of restrictions. I think that was really cool to see, and hear Shiro Shinobi sort of comment on that, and just to get to see it play out in sort of the best case scenario. He's definitely like an actual sort of like hometown hero in this sort of instance here, and everything comes afoot. And I don't know, it's interesting to wonder if people thought this was like an act or if they thought this was a real thing going on. But it all works out in the end for Bolin, and Varric is finally caught for everything that he's been doing.
Mm-hmm. And then we get a lot of different resolution scenes here. So Lin outside explains basically what happened to Raiko. It's noted that like, hey, did no one know about this? And Lin mentions that no, Mako actually was on this, but like no one paid attention really to what he was saying. And he actually gets like some real proper praise from Raiko and Lin here. So Mako being proven right here. Korra then immediately arrives on the scene out of nowhere. She needs Raiko's help, and in comparison to what's it like 205, she's more respectful in how she approaches Raiko here, but she's still echoing the same idea of like, okay, different situation, but it's actually worse. The world is at risk here, but we really do need your help. Like this, you can't not do anything here. And everyone tries to help out here in terms of getting Raiko on side, even Bolin, but Raiko still decides to only focus on defending the city and just kind of playing defense and not giving the support to what kind of actually needs to be done. And I think this is a huge point in terms of like, things would have gone very differently if Raiko actually like agreed to help. Because of what happens in the coming episodes, it's this small attack force trying to get into the portals, and timing and how fast they do it is so important. I think it's a very different situation if like we get the Republic United Forces fleet with the help of everyone else going to the south or whatever. It's a super important scene that just highlights that Raiko is this character that you're meant to criticize. Like, you have doubts because like the early season kind of is framing Korra as not doing things in the right way, but here you see that like, yeah, Raiko's just kind of protecting himself. But what are your thoughts on some of these resolution scenes?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was sort of the best case scenario, and he did sort of send the forces. Would they've had a completely easier time? I think at least getting to the portal, they still would have had an easier time. But I don't know, I think some things still might have been tough the way that Unalak was working, especially with all the spirits with it. But I think it definitely does show that he doesn't really have sort of like the bigger picture in mind per se. Like he's I don't know, maybe a little bit sort of short-sighted, because I mean, they do have, from what we learned later on, they do have a pretty sizable force, right? So there probably could have been at least something that they could have like spared at least a little bit to sort of go with Korra. But again, like you said, he's one of those people characters that are designed for us to sort of question his sort of ideas and his loyalties and where they sort of go here. So definitely seems a bit sort of weird here. But no, I think it's nice to get to see Mako sort of get a win here for once, considering everything that he's sort of been through here. Although there's still some things that the team Avatar itself has to sort of work out, and there's sort of relationships with each other. But I think it's good to see that they're at least starting to get together here, and they do have a common goal that they want to go for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we address some of that stuff immediately next. So Bolin gets Mako out of jail. He apologizes to Mako for like basically the scene earlier on. Mako is kind of like brought out into the kind of lobby. Everyone celebrates, claps, because he was, the one who actually was suspicious of Varrick in the first place, and nobody listened to him. He gets promoted to detective as Lu and Gon are both like demoted, so that's a very positive thing. And this is kind of Mako's big kind of book 2 moment in terms of like, hey, you were completely right, and like you got put in jail, like everything, all this bad stuff happened to you, but no, you were right. You are a really good detective, and we will reward you now for that. So I like that we finally get the big Mako moment. Then we get the kind of like the drama stuff comes out. Of course, Korra arrives back on the scene. She's delighted to see Mako again, hugs, and then kisses him. So this is obviously the big kind of surprise moment that because it was such a public kind of breakup that they had, everyone's just like, huh? Asami, of course, has an annoyed reaction to this. And Mako's just confused and is just like, do you not remember our fight? And she reveals that she doesn't have all of her memories back, so she doesn't remember the breakup, obviously. And he doesn't reveal that they broke up in this moment, I guess, just because of the drama going on. He's just like, should I do this and maybe affect what's going to happen going forward with the stakes on the line? But it's the drama of the team kind of comes out again in terms of like, okay, here's the drama focused writing, and the part of book 2 that I think deserves to be criticized is some of this stuff, because it feels like it's not necessarily about like what is Asami's relationship with Mako or Korra's relationship with Mako. It's just relationship drama stuff. So that's my main criticism. But otherwise, like, I think a lot of stuff is great. Like Mako's big moment, I think, is fantastic. But what are your thoughts on these scenes?
Yeah, I definitely can see sort of the validness behind the criticism there in terms of how they chose to go about going the relationship. But I mean, I think it is an awkward situation to be put in. So I can see why Mako wouldn't necessarily know what to do in that sort of situation there, and trying not to make a scene. But definitely feels like at least soon after there could have been somewhere to sort of like reconcile that without sort of blowing everything up. But I don't know. I think that's something that they're sort of trying to play up for whatever sort of reasons in terms of the story here.
Mm-hmm. Then there's a scene where the team all go to visit Varrick in prison, and they basically need like his some kind of systems and some of the stuff, the resources that he has. You get a note that like, hey, he's helped everyone here in some way except Mako. They obviously turn it around and are like, no, you actually manipulated, lied to all of us in some way or another. They want Asami's stuff back, of course, that he took. And he says it's all on his battleship, which is called the Zhu Li, and we get a bunch of jokes around that. He gives the ship to them, so they now have a battleship and a way to actually get to where they need to go. So that's sort of our kind of resolution here in terms of like, okay, Varrick as a villain is still this kind of funny villain. Like, that's the way we're characterizing him here. Like, he has caused a lot of chaos and has not really helped things, but he is still this character that we're characterizing him in this way where he can still joke around with the characters overall. And so it's not that they absolutely hate and despise him. It's an interesting kind of like tightrope to kind of walk with him here, but I think they play it pretty well to where like the kind of turnaround with the character in the coming seasons actually makes a bit of sense, where he's more like annoyed everyone, but he's useful kind of type thing. Um, but what are your thoughts on this scene where they visit Varric?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is played up for laugh. Just the fact that he has his own sort of custom jail cell because he thought he might end up there one day, and how Zuli is actually with him there. It definitely sort of try to make it seem like a fun prison scene compared to like when Mako was in there and Bolin was talking to him. So no, there's definitely a huge contrast there, and he is able to help them in some regard towards their actual sort of like current goals. So like you know, there's positives with the negatives and everything with him. It's just sort of, what side of the coin are you on at, any point in time. So yeah, it's definitely something to see how they do with this character. And yeah, I think, and in the end, they do a pretty good job of resoluting his sort of character towards a more sort of positive side of things. So he's definitely one of those more, I guess, sort of like chaotic characters and just like inherently evil ones.
Yeah, because his motivations here were like completely like financial, basic. Now, obviously, it's sort of like villainous that he was using like an actual situation happening in the south for that goal, but they do it reasonably well. The final scene here, because we already discussed the Tonrock Unalaq stuff, is on the ship. Mako kind of comes out to sort of console Korra because she's dealing with like wanted to get Janora back. They need to take down Unalaq. They hug. He gives her some kind of confidence, and it's kind of like this is where you kind of realize that okay, in this particular instance, it's like heading into the battle. Is it the right time to kind of reveal the truth about what happened and potentially create a rift within the group? It's a unusual situation, but obviously it's not helped by a bunch of the other scenarios going on here. I still maintain that I think it's less the Mako Korra stuff, and I think it's more the fact that they did decide to have Asami and Mako get back together and then not really develop it like at all. And that is kind of the issue here, because that's what creates the kind of the true drama of this. Whereas I actually think, just in terms of Mako Korra's relationship, just this issue here without the fact that like, oh, he's kind of half in a relationship with Asami, that's what adds the kind of real drama angle to it. But I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on just like the at this point, like in the arc here of book 2, why are they doing this stuff with the relationship drama?
Yeah, I don't know. It definitely feels like it's something that they didn't necessarily have to go for. I mean, I guess they're trying to sort of play up on sort of the sort of like heightened tensions when Asami and Mako were sort of like working together. So like I get it from that perspective, but I don't think it needs to sort of be, I don't know, sort of dragged out in this sort of way, or, there could have been some way to actually sort of, I don't know, have some sort of conversation with Korra before sort of like this final moment here, where this definitely feels like it would be an awkward time to sort of do that, considering everything that they have to do. But the longer that they have it go on for, as we can see later on, the more issues that it creates within the group, even if, not all the parties are aware of that there actually is an issue. So it doesn't, it doesn't help anybody in the long run.
Yeah, because when we get to like the finale, like 214, I think they ultimately resolve the kind of Mako Korra relationship well with the scene that they have. It's just the like Asami Mako does just completely fade into the background after this point. Like, to the point where I'm kind of like, I don't obviously in my head at this moment like remember like, is there a breakup scene necessarily? Like, I don't really think there is, because were they really back together properly? And that's the problem. They do move away, I think, from the overly dramatic kind of romance writing like immediately after this season, so that's obviously for the better, and hopefully it is something they've maybe in general learned for, like, I suppose future content as well, is that like don't kind of manufacture your own shipping drama stuff. Let the fans do that. But yeah, that is Night of 1,000 Stars overall, as like, yeah, it's the opening stage of the kind of 4-part finale, and we obviously get into the bigger stuff with the next episode, because it's literally called Harmonic Convergence. So it'll be exciting to see that. But we'll immediately jump over to 207 Zuko Alone. Huge fan favorite episode, just like the one before this, of course, The Blind Bandit. So a really nice run of episodes for book 2 for Avatar here. And yeah, this is a great episode. Zuko on his own, we go really deep, properly deep into his backstory for this time here, in terms of like getting introduced to like Ursa and the like conspiracy effectively happening in terms of who's vying for the throne and how Ozai takes the throne, why Ursa isn't around anymore, characterizing like Azula in the past, but also what Zuko was like and how that relates to what he's doing in the Earth Kingdom town throughout this episode. Like it's a really, really well done episode from pretty much like every point. And especially looking back at it now, when we have the search comic to like add even further context in terms of like it's presented as a mystery, the steps between some of the backstory moments. Now we have those gaps like filled in, and I think it works like just as well. And I like the extra details that we have that we can go into here a bit. But overall, what are your thoughts on Zuko Alone?
Overall I agree. It's definitely fan favorite, a personal, favorite episode, just for what it does for Zuko and his character, and sort of, having him, more realize his sort of like his true sort of purpose, his true idea, what he really sort of, at least beginning to sort of hold dear to himself, and having to sort of realize that despite everything that's sort of going on. So I think it's a great episode for that. And like you said, having understanding of sort of the behind the scenes of this now, through the comics, I think is a great to see, sort of, to fill in the gaps, like you said, to have the understanding of what's going on. It definitely feels like there's a lot going on that we didn't know initially, and now we do actually know that, and we can see, why this was, the whole idea of what happened with Zuko Mom could have been, a whole sort of like mini movie on its own, which, the creators had the idea to make from, the very sort of beginning. So definitely can understand how there's, a lot of sort of history here, and we do, we go back like 4 or 5 times in flashbacks here just to sort of fill in sort of stuff here, and there's so much more that we do get, and there probably even could be as well.
Yeah, and like there's even more than that. Like there's stuff to be discussed here with like Iroh, like one of the kind of earlier looks at Iroh that like we've debated about like as fans like so many times about like what's the interpretation of where is Iroh at this stage in his journey, and there's stuff to talk about there. But yeah, let's go through this one. So we open up, of course, Zuko on his own, on his ostrich horse. He's starving, basically looking for food. He does find a couple who are making food, and he thinks about sort of like ambushing them, stealing it, but then he sees that the woman is pregnant and stops. He moves on. He'll find food elsewhere. Obviously, it's a fun fact that like this is Ying and Thon, who we, of course, the gang run into later on, and we see the birth of this child. It's an important event, like 6 episodes from now, or 5 episodes from now. So that's it. That's a fun fact, just highlighting that the two groups are traveling the same kind of paths, more or less. But then, yeah, he nearly passes out, and then as he does this, he kind of thinks about his mother, and so we get our look at Ursa here. But then he does arrive in the town. He immediately catches the attention of the local soldiers. He goes to buy food, and there's an interesting exchange here where he's like, I want to buy like feed for the ostrich horse and food for myself, but he's told that like you don't have enough for like a hot meal for yourself, so he actually just accepts the 2 bags of feed for the ostrich horse. So it's kind of highlighting that he's prioritizing the health of his like animal over himself, which is all these little things kind of telling you, I suppose, the core of who Zuko is as a character, which is what this episode is about. And you see that in so many of his actions here when it comes to that sort of stuff. And it's immediately followed up, of course, by the kids come out, they throw eggs at the soldiers. Zuko doesn't like give them up and say they did it. He stands his ground. He accepts the soldiers taking the feed that he just bought and walks off. And it is mentioned here, this is a part of the episode as well, that the soldiers in this town, they're Earth Kingdom soldiers. They're meant to protect them from the Fire Nation, but they're basically just thugs out for themselves. And so there's so many like unique and interesting angles here when it comes to like Zuko is kind of still kind of technically the villain, but the real villain are actually these Earth Kingdom soldiers in this episode. And there's a lot of complexity introduced like already just from the opening kind of couple of scenes here. But what are your thoughts on how it starts off?
Yeah, I think you begin to sort of, see sort of the ideas of what, Zuko can really sort of be as like a person when he's sort of, doesn't have as many sort of like, external sort of influences like guiding him towards what they think is going to be the right thing. I mean, yeah, he's sort of like down on his luck, right? Like he doesn't have any food, his food is getting taken away from him, and he's, almost going to pass out here a couple of times, but you can see that he has some priorities in mind, which I think is it's nice to see that with this character. Like he doesn't really say much of anything at all, right? Like he's just sort of just trying to sort of get by here, but you can understand that he's just trying to sort of keep going and keep going on, and eventually it seems like that sort of connects him with the people around him.
So then the main kind of boy here who like threw the eggs, his name is Lee. He offers like us to like make amends for what he kind of caused here a little bit. Offers to kind of like, hey, come home with me. We'll feed your ostrich horse. And so we're introduced to Lee's parents here, Gansu and Sela. And they obviously talk as well. They introduce the idea that they have an older son as well, Sensu. And he is participating in the war. And I think there's another like criticism of the soldiers here of like Sensu is an actual like soldier on the front line kind of truly helping, whereas the soldiers in the village are just viewed as like basically extorting the people of the town more or less. So there's another kind of like Zuko's sort of honor kind of moment here where like they offer him food but he refuses it, but then they realize like, oh, we see why you're refusing this. Why don't you help work to like fix the barn and then come in and eat? And he agrees to this. And there's a quick scene then while he's in the middle of trying to do this up on top of the roof where Lee just keeps asking these like intrusive questions about what are you doing? Where'd you get the scar from? But it's actually the father, Gansu, is just like, look, a man's past is his own. It's his own business. Kind of leave him to it. So again, lots of kind of fun little moments here. But I like in the background of this that like obviously the backstory stuff is the focus, but I do like the kind of in a way plot with the family, the introduction of the depth of like that Lee's older brother is away at war, and it's like for Zuko hearing about this is a soldier basically fighting against his nation, but like he connects with this family, and as we go through it, we see this sort of almost the tragedy of kind of what happens. So the depth here, I think, is really strong immediately. But what are your thoughts on this the scene here with the introduction of Lee and his family?
Yeah, I like this. I think it's a good way for Zuko to sort of connect with the people around him, right? Like, and these are people on the other side of the fence, right? So these are the people that, his nation is attacking, right? And has been attacking for like the last 100 years, right? So this is, a chance for him to really sort of, come to terms, or at least to begin to come to terms of, what he's, technically been a part of for his whole sort of life here. So I like that he gets to see this. Like, he doesn't, say much. He doesn't say his backstory or anything like that. Like, the father says, he can keep all that stuff to himself here. But, they can see that he's been through some stuff, right? Like, I think that's probably pretty obvious from looking at Zuko at this point in time. So, their willingness to help him in this sort of situation, with the encouragement of the younger boy as well here. So it's nice to get to see, that sort of, side of Zuko without having to do much. He's able to sort of find some help, in this sort of town here.
Mm-hmm. But the mention of his past here does kind of make Zuko think about his past. So this is where we get the first flashback scene. We see when he's younger, him and his mother sitting down by the kind of pond, feeding the turtle ducks. But then Zuko kind of demonstrates the way that Azula feeds the turtle ducks by just throwing a rock at one of the kind of babies. He's immediately attacked by the mother and questions like, why would they attack me in response? And Ursa, where we're properly introduced to her here, scolds Zuko for this and notes that mothers are very protective of their babies, which is obviously like a kind of almost ominous one given what kind of happens here, that like it's such a foreshadowing moment, her saying this with how this flashback actually kind of ends towards the end of the episode. But it immediately highlights that like he had this amazing relationship with his mother, like super super close. It also brings up, of course, straight away the idea of like Azula's always had this kind of questionable like edge to her, even from when she was younger, with regards to like her behavior. So lots of stuff immediately when we're in this more kind of family focused backstory that we get here. But I suppose we have to go through this in detail here. So what are your thoughts on just this first scene here, meeting Ursa and so on?
Yeah, no, I thought this was good. It's nice to finally get sort of this real sort of characterization of his mother, and at least in this point in time, and how their relationship, their dynamic actually was, and how, how it seemed pretty positive. Like, we've seen Zuko go through so much stuff. We've heard some mentions of his mother up until this point, but we never really had sort of, I guess, sort of the full sort of understanding context. So these flashbacks really sort of give us a full scope of where they were at, and how, everyone sort of interacted together, these many years ago. So it was great to see this, and to see, how well they actually went on with each other at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting as well that like Ursa does sort of like scold Zuko a little bit here, like, but the difference I suppose between this and like Azula is that like it's clear that Zuko takes this on board, and like he won't throw stuff at turtle ducks anymore, whereas Azula, you already know, is kind of aware that most of the you shouldn't do this, it just kind of bounces off Azula, and that's kind of part of the issue of maybe some of the dynamics here. But we continue the flashback, and they then walk past Azula, who's playing with obviously a young May and Ty Lee. And Azula kind of does a little bit of kind of manipulation, but it's not really too heavy here. She notes May's kind of crush on Zuko and gets Ursa to kind of force Zuko to play with them. Then she and Ty Lee kind of engineered this situation. They put the apple on May's head. Azula firebends it. Zuko saves May from the burning apple by like tackling her into the pond, and Azula and Ty Lee just kind of laugh at the two of them, noting that they're a cute couple. So this is a kind of cool little thing where like we were teased with this before, the idea that like there's something between May and Zuko. Here we see just how far back it kind of goes, and you see more of the kind of playful, kind of mischievous side of Azula here, but also the fact that there's some manipulation at play from her as well, always playing some sort of a game with someone. But it's definitely a fun situation, and it also kind of plays into the idea of like Azula almost trying to get situations where like Zuko doesn't have Ursa around to kind of protect him as well. But what are your thoughts on the end of this flashback?
Yeah. You sort of wonder how deep Azula's sort of manipulations sort of go, from, when she was young to where we eventually see her in the end. And I don't know, I mean, I guess you could say this seems more of the innocuous type of sort of situation here. But, it's still her sort of taking advantage of the situation towards, her own sort of benefit, to sort of make fun of Zuko and Mai together here. And I don't know, it's definitely sort of like a cute scene just to see them sort of as younger sort of characters here. But I don't know, it's definitely something to sort of, understand sort of where they were back then, that they already had conflicts with each other even when they were that sort of young there. But it seems like, some of them had like slightly better relationships, but even between, Azula and Mai, you can see how, Azula still doesn't like being sort of like stood up in any sort of situations where, she's not quite able to do sort of the gymnastics that even young Ty Lee is able to do.
Yeah. And then we do get the Iroh scene here. So we see Iroh kind of writing a letter home from the siege of Ba Sing Se. We see he has breached the outer wall of Ba Sing Se, and he jokes that like it'd be great for everyone to see it if we don't burn it to the ground first. He sends a present back for Zuko and Azula, a dagger with the inscription "Never give up without a fight" for Zuko, and Azula gets a doll in the latest Earth Kingdom fashion. Zuko, of course, really likes his gift. Azula doesn't really, so she just burns hers. Whereas the implication here, I'm guessing, this is kind of what starts Zuko's interests in kind of like bladed weapons and this kind of element of his character, that because he's not the most talented firebender, he makes up for it with his skills with swords, kind of what we go on from here. But then Azula asked the question that, like, if Iroh doesn't make it back from war, that makes Ozai, our father, next in line. And Ursa is just like, don't speak like that, please. That we don't do that here, of like talking about basically hoping people die. And this is when she does burn the doll. So lots of stuff going on here, but of course the main one here is like seeing Iroh in more of a like typical kind of Fire Nation military kind of position of like, oh yeah, like he was kind of leading the charge against the Earth Kingdom. But what is so complicated about this is that this is post certain like key stages of his story. Like some of the big moments we know about this character have happened earlier on in his life, and that this is how he feels he has to fulfill his destiny, is by taking Ba Sing Se. That I think we even had some stuff from, I think it was one of the podcasts, they might have talked about this, Mike and Brian, even somewhat recently, that they almost view it as like Iroh feels that by like ending the war as soon as possible, even with the Fire Nation winning, it's kind of almost like better for the world than a hugely protracted war where so many people will die. And it's just interesting to think about like Iroh's mindset during this moment where he's not the exactly like Ozai in this situation here. This is a character who like Ursa is really close to at this point already. But he's a little bit off his sort of like true path, and there's so much we still kind of don't fully know, but it's just interesting to look back on this moment overall. But what are your thoughts on this? I suppose we'll start with the kind of Iroh discussion here. What do you make of this scene?
Yeah, no, it definitely does add some intrigue to his character, because he is, sort of the general in this battle that's sort of, trying to take over the Earth Kingdom, right? And, at this point in time, we've seen that they've breached the outer wall, right? The outer wall has sort of fallen at this point. So, clearly there's progress being made, and they're doing, a good job of laying siege to the city for, these amount of days, right? Of course, we know what happens in the end here, but right now it definitely feels like he's on track for what he thinks is his sort of destiny. And I don't know, it's always interesting to get the idea from like sort of the extra stuff that people have mentioned about it, that this is sort of like his mindset of like doing right in the world by taking over, which to a lot of people would seem sort of like counterintuitive, but that's sort of his mindset, at least in this point in time. And I'm sure other people in the Fire Nation wouldn't necessarily see it that way, but that's his justification for this, right? So that's where he's going in this point in time. And we do know that he is part of other things right now that probably sort of like conflict with this idea, right? So it's interesting. He has all these different layers to his character and to his sort of like character traits that sort of sometimes seem like they're at ends with each other, right? Because he still feels like he has sort of that fun goingness. Like I think Azula even calls him like his royalty loving kookiness. So we already know he's all about tea and stuff like that. So like he has the funness to him, but he's still this sort of hardened sort of Fire Nation prince, right? So that's still his role here. So there's definitely a lot to his character, which I think is why he's so interesting to a lot of people.
Yeah, because like the timeline, I think we have to bring it up here, is like at this point he has already been judged worthy by Ran and Shaw, and had the Sun Warrior encounter, Dragon of the West, all that sort of stuff. That's happened already. Learning from waterbenders how to make basically the lightning redirection technique, that's already happened. It's the stuff that happens like after Lu Ten's death is like Order of the White Lotus and the spirit world kind of journey aspect. So it's this interesting thing where like being judged worthy by the dragons is like a really notable point. And then like from like Legacy of the Fire Nation, we know that like he was always sort of aware that like, oh, I'm being like forced into this rivalry against Ozai, but it's making Ozai into something, and I'm aware that this is happening, and I'm kind of like choosing not to be influenced by that in the way that like typically happens in the Fire Nation kind of families among siblings. So it is such an interesting one, just because it does come back to that like destiny and the whole vision of taking Ba Sing Se as like this is what he's working towards, but it took so long to realize it's take it back from the Fire Nation. But we will move on. Yeah, so there's that, and then that night Lee actually takes out Zuko's swords to practice, and we get a fun moment here of effectively Zuko almost like fulfilling the role of Lee's older brother Sensu, teaching him here how to hold them properly and some instruction on the sword. Lee even saying that Zuko and Sensu would actually get on if they ever met. So that's a pretty notable one, because the episode ends and like Sensu and like what exactly happens here, we'll get into it later, just left sort of unresolved overall. But it's definitely a fun little scene showing him kind of bonding really well, and you can see that Lee is super latched onto him. He kind of needs an older brother figure in his life. But your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that they have this sort of, moment of connecting and sort of, understanding with all the situations that's going on in the war as the sort of backdrop for things here, because it feels like, Zuko is able to sort of, provide this, sort of like you're saying, this sort of like mentorship here, that seems to be sort of needed here. And, even if it, doesn't really amount to anything in the end, and of course things go, the worst way possible, but end of things, it's like a nice sort of like calm moment here.
Mm-hmm. Then Zuko is just about to leave when the soldiers arrive. So this is where we get the reveal here. Gao, who's the main kind of soldier in the village, says that Sensu's battalion was captured, and then him and his friends proceed to basically taunt like Lee's family about what will happen, what they heard about what will happen to like the last group of Earth Kingdom soldiers that was captured by the Fire Nation, and they just greatly upset the family here. Zuko steps in to sort of like force them to go away, and it's clear that Gao doesn't necessarily want to deal with Zuko, and so he kind of sends them away. But yeah, this is a real scene where it obviously makes Gao into a real villain, just for kind of almost loving revealing this to the family, in terms of like why is he so eager to kind of taunt them over this. But this is the kind of reality of the war, of just like Zuko's finding out that I guess his nation won this engagement, but this family has now, who knows, potentially like lost their oldest son, and they follow this up with a flashback where something very similar happens, and that's what prompts the flashback. So it's really nicely written and connected in that way. But I just like that they actually develop the family here, where you really care about them, where there's a real reaction of like father, mother to hearing that this has happened. But your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, no, I think this is very sort of impactful and emotional here. It doesn't really seem like there's any sort of reason for these Earth Nation soldiers to sort of like do this. Like this is, I don't know, it's really sort of like belittling. It's really like, bully mode mentality, as, gets stated later on. But, it's what they choose to do. And, this is such like a, like out of the way of them to sort of do this here, but it definitely, shows the Zuko just sort of straight up what's sort of happening and how, how it affects these families. The father, he's the one that's going to go and sort of find out sort of the truth for things, but he has to go away to do this. There's no like instant communication in order for him to find this. He has to leave his family in order to find this information about, his other son. So it just puts them in sort of the worst case scenario here as we lead to in the next couple moments here. But yeah, it's definitely, this happens on both sides of the equation, right? Which is why Zuko, has this sort of, flashback towards this happening in another way.
Yeah, it is the reverse. Yeah, Ursa in the flashback gets a letter, and she immediately starts to cry because Luten, Iroh's son, has died in battle, and we kind of leave it there for now. We'll obviously continue the flashback in just a second, but we cut out of it after just this initial reveal. Gansu, the father, is going to go to the front and to try and get Sensu back in some way, and we don't. That's the resolution on that side of things, is that we never come back to that. We don't know specifically what happened here. Is this just him going in hope, or is there already the assumption that like Sensu is dead? Because if you kind of almost connect it to the flashback and like Luten died, is that the kind of implication here? And like it's just Gansu going to sort of like get the confirmation about this, and that's kind of a brutal kind of thought to have. But as like Zuko leaves, he does give the dagger he got from Iroh to Lee, so passing it on. Nice moment. But what are your thoughts on this? We get the Luten reveal here.
Yeah, I don't know, it's sad. It's definitely, this is the sort of things that sort of happen in this sort of situation, right? And it's never fun or enjoyable to sort of hear how this happens, and it definitely feels like it affects Ursula, affects Zuko, to some degree in this sort of quick sort of scene here with, Azula in the backdrop here. And we don't get her reaction till a little bit later, but, we can see how she, might possibly react to it. But yeah, even with the family here, and this, like you said, it is sort of like a unresolved thing, and I don't know if something that they would ever sort of like, even bother to sort of come back to, or even to see this village again, later on, especially with Zuko and everything he eventually becomes. How would that sort of turn out in that sort of situation here? But yeah, it's definitely just a sad moment on both sides here.
Yeah, like the Ursa kind of moment at the start of her crying is especially kind of like emotional if you've read the comics, because you know that like Iroh is this kind of like one of the few bright points in her life in the palace, basically, is that like she does view Iroh as being someone very important in her life, and so her finding out that he lost his son is a huge kind of thing. And if I remember correctly, like just before like Ursa has her kind of like big moment with Ozai in one of the comics, I think it is discussed like she brings this up, kind of finally talking to him again. So there's some nice stuff in the comics that adds more to this as well. But I definitely almost like would, like, as just a short story idea, love to see like return to this, like see what's up with Lee these days, and like did something happen to Sensu, and like because the dagger, like I suppose it's given back to him, I suppose. Like it'd be interesting to see if anything else happens with like the dagger, and overall just because like Zuko helps to end the war, and just feels like notable because it's from such a key episode. But anyway, back into flashback then, in relation to kind of like the dagger, the knife. Zuko's practicing with the knife. Azula kind of taunts him for not being very good. She reveals to Zuko that Iroh is coming home. He has abandoned the siege of Ba Sing Se, and she really kind of lays into Iroh about like, it's a shameful thing that he's coming home, crying from the siege. He sort of stayed there and like finished the fight. But Zuko's very understanding of this, and it's just like he lost his only son. He's probably really sad, and he's almost a bit like, do you not get that, Azula? Ursa arrives, and Azula talks about how basically Azulon will probably die soon, and someone will need to replace him. And it's another kind of little bit of a warning moment for Ursa, where she's just very concerned about some of these things that Azula is saying, and she almost like doesn't really know exactly how to handle some of Azula's behavior. So it's an interesting scene, because you see how eager Azula is to constantly like belittle Zuko, and like, she clearly like obviously favors Ozai. She wants Ozai to get the throne, and it's just the way she talks about her grandfather so kind of like brazenly about like basically wanting him to die. It's like, okay, like they're this is interesting early characterization of Azula as well. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, it definitely does sort of put a highlight on her character and sort of, I don't know, where her mental or where she's been influenced, right? Because she's pretty young here, so it's not like these are coming, directly from her or anything like this, but she's been led up to this point to believe, sort of, you know, her dad would be the better person to be in charge of things, right? And to be on sort of the forces attacking and, sort of the honor of the Fire Nation. So the sort of education that, sort of the Fire Nation has, she definitely has been sort of like a full student of that, maybe even to the more extreme in regards of that, considering Zuko seems to still have some compassion overall, even if he is still more Fire Nation compared to any other sort of nation, right? So it's definitely something to see here and to see the interaction with Ursa, and you definitely do get the sense that there's something going on that she doesn't sort of understand, and is there something that she could have done better? Maybe, maybe not. She doesn't quite know that.
Yeah, and then there is that sort of situation of like, you can see that like Ursa has like a certain amount of like freedom, but like you get the impression that if she was to overly like try to like influence Azula to be very different than what Ozai wants, like Ursa would get herself into trouble just because of how overall controlling Ozai is. So you sort of see the idea that like Azula's kind of heading down like the wrong path here, but like Ursa just being there to kind of constantly be like, no, that's not right, is kind of giving you hope in a way that like especially talking about like modern like Azula, it's like Ursa was in Azula's life long enough that like there is still hope for the character, and that's why like there's so much interest in like these two meeting again and how exactly that will ever resolve itself. But we continue the flashback. So they're obviously heading out to this meeting with Azulon because Ozai wants to talk to him. The kids kind of try to show off basically in front of Azulon. Azula, of course, impresses because she's perfect, basically. She's really advanced firebending. Zuko tries to do the same, but he really, really struggles. And the little cuts to like Ozai's amazed expression at Azula's skill, and then the utter disdain when Zuko kind of fails and makes him look bad, basically. So you can see Ozai clearly prefers Azula. Zuko, just trying his best. Ursa encourages him for his willingness to kind of keep trying despite his struggles. And then, Azulon basically orders everyone else out. He wants to speak to Ozai. And this is where Ozai asks for Iroh's birthright to be revoked and talks about how I have my kids, I have like my full family. Iroh has like abandoned the siege. He doesn't have a son. The future of the Fire Nation is me, basically, is kind of what he's saying. And Ozai does not get at all the reaction he wanted, expected, because Azulon is furious at this, of like, basically, you want me to betray my own firstborn, and so he's going to punish Ozai here. Zuko, like, Azula kind of like, brings Zuko in behind the kind of curtain so they get to overhear some of this. Zuko leaves just before he hears the really important part, but Azula does stay behind to watch, because she's interested. Like, even though her father is getting in trouble here, she's just like, she wants to see this. And then we get it. I suppose I'll cover this bit as well. So she then appears before Zuko, taunting him, saying that like, Dad's going to kill you. And she basically quotes what was said, and that like Ozai has punished Ozai by saying that you must understand the pain of losing a firstborn son. You have to sacrifice your own firstborn, that being Zuko. And Ursa arrives and basically takes Azula off to get the details, because she's kind of like, wait, I heard the end of that. What just happened? And we see the end of this scene actually play out in the comic, which we'll get to in just a second. But yeah, this is a hugely important scene because like Ozai asking his father for the birthright is kind of what causes the whole sequence of events to actually happen. And it's like, what did he expect in a way? That's the kind of like point here, is a really, really interesting one. But what are your thoughts on all of this? Like getting a lot of stuff here, like meeting Azulan properly for the first time and all this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. It feels like, for all of sometimes the like shrewdness that we think that Ozai does have, maybe this was like a early instance where he just did a really bad job on reading the room, or he thought he could like step above his sort of station, because it definitely seems like this was like the wrong moment to sort of abdicate for this sort of, position jump in sort of the royal family here. Because, I mean, Azulan, he does seem like he's sort of the sort of standard sort of like, Fire Nation leader that's, pretty ruthless in, most regards. And, of course he's continued the war, right? So like, it's not like, this is, no, it's not like he's like opponent to sort of like the sort of brutality that sometimes the Fire Nation has to inflict. But, at least in terms of his own family, he has that sort of, understanding here, which it seems like Ozai and conversely Azula sort of lack that quality, lack that little bit of empathy. So it definitely seems like this just does not, obviously it does not work out. And like you said, this is sort of what starts sort of like a cascading series of event that, leads to like everything that we see that happens later on. So it's definitely sort of a situation that just sort of, doesn't play out in sort of the best way, at least initially. I think, for Ozai, of course, it works out towards what he wants in the end, but not necessarily, I think this was a little bit more of like a forced hand situation that sort of fell into his lap with everything that happened with Ursa, that just sort of worked out his way that, necessarily wouldn't have worked out this way. It probably would have gone a lot worse.
Yeah, like it is a really good point about the whole idea of like Azulan, as villainous as he is, just like Sozin and Ozai and stuff like that, they at least kind of give him the element of like he understands kind of what Iroh is going through, kind of like losing his son, and to see his other son immediately try and be like, give me the power, give me the throne, the day afterwards, basically, that's a problem for him. Whereas, yeah, like Ozai is later characterized, it's really pointed out in the comics that like he does not care about anyone basically except himself. Like family doesn't really matter to him. Even Azula, it's just you're skilled, I can use you. That's the way it gets kind of characterized as we go forward. And that's where, like, of course, there's the element with Azula where she's heading down that same path, but we see she does care about like other people and like how they perceive her, and there's just that element of hope there with the character that we can kind of come back to. So yeah, and then there's also just the throughout this whole thing that element of like firstborn versus secondborn, the competition between royal fire siblings that we've seen kind of throughout the different generations, and how they, pit them against each other, which obviously Azulan did as well, but because Iroh in a way like chose not to super engage with that, you see that Ozai has doubled down on that. It's an interesting like angle overall. So from there we get the comic scene. Yes. So yeah, we do in the comic, The Search, directly get the follow-up to Ursa kind of basically brings Azula out after this initial sequence. And so she says, "Spill it, Azula. Well, I accidentally overheard Grandfather talking to Daddy in the throne room." Accidentally? Daddy asked for Uncle Iroh's birthright, and Grandfather got really, really mad. He couldn't believe Daddy would do something like that so soon after Cousin Liu Ten's death. Now for his punishment, Daddy has to get rid of Zuko. Grandfather wants him to know the pain of losing his firstborn. And then she says, kind of puts on the act a little bit here. "Oh, Mommy, I'm so scared for Zuko. You don't think Daddy would really do something like that, do you?" And Ursa's just like, "Go to bed." As Azula kind of watches this kind of play out, kind of highlighting a little bit that she took a little bit of joy in like revealing this to her mother here. and then we get the actual like confrontation, because in the episode, as we'll kind of get to here, the next flashback scene we get is Ursa wakes Zuko up, says her like kind of final line to him, and then leaves, and that's all Zuko actually knows. And so it's kind of incredible that we have to go back to like 2013 basically. That's when we got the reveal of kind of the truth behind this in the kind of middle of the scenes. But we'll get to the details of the Ursa Ozai kind of scene in just a second overall. But just in terms of like the fact that we got the other side of this scene, we did get the Azula Ursa continuation in the comic. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool that, I mean, even if it is in another format than what, would have been sort of like ideal, right? It's cool that we actually did get to see sort of, them sort of discussing, seeing Azula, seeing, Ursa's sort of reaction to finding out this sort of information, this sort of, worst case scenario, and, just sort of putting it into play, sort of the protectiveness that Ursa, the lengths that she would go to protect her son, or, her kids in general. It's definitely something that I don't think we would have expected to see, especially considering like from when this first sort of aired all those many years ago, and just sort of the mystery behind it. You never really quite sort of understood what was going on. We just sort of saw the sort of end result of things, right? So it's really cool to sort of see or understand sort of that sort of, finer sort of detail that, something that, probably would have just been a mystery for forever.
But we'll get through the episode here. So we then cut back out into the present. So Sayla, the mother, comes up to Zuko for help. The soldiers have taken Lee after they kind of found him with the knife. And Zuko's basically like, okay, I'm going to have to finally deal with these soldiers. He's ready to fight. And that's basically what we get. We get the confrontation right in the middle of the village here. Gao and his 3 men. He has his men attack first, and Zuko, just without properly drawing his sword, takes these 3 out like no problem whatsoever. And then we build to the big fight, Gao versus Zuko, and we get the reveal that, okay, Gao's an earthbender, and he uses these double hammers. And so it's this really kind of powerhouse earthbender against Zuko, only using the swords. And it's amazing how well Zuko does to defend against this, because he has to basically full-on block giant chunks of rock with his blades, and he can only do that so much. He takes a couple of hits, then eventually takes a really powerful hit and is nearly knocked out, and this is what kind of initiates the next flashback scene. I think it's a really cool fight scene, because it gets across Zuko's skill, but also gets across that like Gao is actually a pretty good like powerhouse earthbender as well, with the relatively still, in the grand scheme of the franchise, unique fighting style of using 2 hammers, which I don't think have really seen since this episode. But your thoughts on the action scene here?
Yeah, I mean, the action scene, like you said, it is pretty good. It is, feel like, I guess it's a bit of a unique, sort of skill, using the hammers in order to sort of like manipulate the earth around you, right? Like that feels like this something different in itself, even if, in the end, the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really help him any better, but maybe Zuko's just that much better than him in that sort of way. Or maybe it is a crutch for him to sort of be using those hammers in that way. But visually, it looks cool. It looks interesting. And we get to see sort of, Zuko, some of his blade skill before eventually he gets sort of like overpowered there, right? So it's definitely cool to see, Zuko use sort of the swords, twin swords, in that sort of, flowing manner, and how, for the most part, it worked pretty well. I guess definitely shows you how, an unarmed person to some degree can, sort of fight benders, depending on their skill level and stuff like that. So definitely a good sort of fight scene here in an episode that you might not necessarily think it would have one.
Yeah, it definitely brings up the general discussion about like, using a weapon to sort of like augment your bending, because we'll see Zuko use fire bending with his swords. And it's like the only time he ever does it in the series. Even though when like you discuss Zuko in terms of fantasy fights, most people want you to incorporate the two together. It's like, we only have this one example of Zuko actually firebending at the same time as using his swords, and like how useful necessarily is that? Because like obviously we have the example of airbenders with their staffs, Kyoshi with the fans, and they kind of emphasized the idea that that helped her to kind of make her bending a little bit more precise before she was like properly skilled. So I do wonder, like you say, like is the hammers like, does it amplify his strength, or is he kind of just using it to kind of like make up for maybe something else? I'm assuming it probably in this case is like it is this kind of specialized thing to just make to move a lot of earth around. Is that if you channel earth bending through like a hammer strike, you break up more of the ground, because the quote unquote finishing move that Gao does is seems pretty strong, like the amount of earth that comes up to knock Zuko back. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just the specifics about like bending being augmented with weapons.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the way that he uses it here in this instance, it definitely feels like it's pretty effective. Like it gives him more range on his motions than he might normally have as like, sort of your typical earthbending moves and stuff like that. At least that's how it sort of comes across, because he doesn't have to like maybe sort of like dig in as deep as, maybe a normal earthbender would. But maybe that's, sort of a skill thing. Like if you're more skilled, you don't necessarily have to do that regardless. Like, like Toph never seems to have any issue with that, but Toph is also one of the best earthbenders in the world. So maybe that's a bad comparison there. Same thing if you were to look at, say, like Boomy or something like that. But it definitely seems like it works pretty well here. His last move, like you said, it did seem pretty strong in this sort of instance here. It definitely gets a lot of earth out pretty quickly, right? So I think that was sort of the purpose of that sort of move there. But I don't know, I feel like we've seen other earthbenders do similar things without needing the use of tools. But I don't know, maybe that's sort of like a training thing in terms of like being part of the military, something like that. Like you can see sort of how those sort of instances can be used, versus like a normal person wouldn't even have access to those sort of like weapons and tools. I don't know. It's definitely interesting to sort of consider.
Yeah. Like the downside obviously is that he doesn't seem to have a lot of defense, because like Zuko does some quick sword firebending attacks, and Gao can't really get the hammers up enough to kind of do any sort of block. So I guess it's a very like all offense style thing, just to move a lot of earth around. But yeah, probably to make up for a lack of kind of technique, where like even someone like a Long Feng can do do a more precise move to get the same effect across. That like, one big earth pillar to the chest rather than needing a whole like fissure coming up out of the ground like this guy does. That's the kind of like the Jonju style of just being like, effortless efficiency just to get the wins and fights, rather than like I dropped a mountain on you type thing. But yeah, we then go into flashback. Zuko's kind of half knocked out here. We get the big flashback scene here. Ursa wakes up Zuko and says that everything that I've done has been for you. She tells him to never forget who you are, and she leaves. And this was basically the last time he saw her until her return, basically in the comics. So this is the big kind of like traumatic moment for Zuko. He doesn't really know the specifics about why this happened, just that he woke up kind of in the middle of Ursa's farewell to him, and she told him, I did it for you, and never forget who you are. Stay kind of true to yourself, basically. A very mysterious scene, because as I said, we skip a lot, like something happens just before this. What is it? And we'll get into that in obviously just a second, addressing the comic. But what are your thoughts on this? This is what goes on to be like this big mystery, even post finale of ATLA. It's like, what happened to Ursa in relation to this?
Yeah. I mean, many people still don't know what happened to Ursa, and it's been in the comics for quite a while now. So, but yeah, no, I definitely, it's one of those moments where it's just like so sort of open ended, and you don't really understand. And back when this happened, like we didn't we didn't even really know what she did fully, right?
Mm.
Like we just knew that she did something and it protected him in some sort of way, right? But like we didn't have the full extent of what she actually did here. And Zuko here is like so sort of even in this moment, like he gets up in like the next sort of bit of flashback, but like even here he doesn't really understand, especially this young, sort of what's going on. So it's something that really feels like there's so much more to it that we really just don't get. It's definitely one of the more, I guess you could say, like single moments that people sort of remember from like the whole sort of series, especially with this episode being so sort of fan favorite as
Hmm.
well.
Back in the present, Gao approaches Zuko to kind of finish the fight, but Zuko gets back up, does a crazy spin move off the ground like he's known for, firebending reveal, and then just blasts Gao with sword firebending and just smashes him into a wall. Like the fight is done at this point. But then his takeaway from remembering like his mother's last words to him is to then, in the middle of all of this, announce himself publicly to the town as like, I am Zuko, son of Fire Lord Ozai and Ursa, prince of the Fire Nation, heir to the throne. And the villagers respond with like, that's not true. You were burned and disowned. He tries to give the knife back to Lee after their great relationship earlier on in the episode, and Lee refuses it. The mother is now kind of like afraid of Zuko. The whole town wants nothing to do with him now just because of this reveal that like how he behaved earlier on in the episode doesn't matter because he is Fire Nation and this town has been heavily affected by kind of Fire Nation and just the whole situation with the war. And it's such an interesting point of the journey because it's Zuko alone, but it's like the first episode of Zuko on his own because he's just left, and this is him during those early moments and kind of taking things in kind of the wrong direction, making some progress, but then going back in kind of the wrong way. And that's kind of the point here is he hasn't quite had the true like awakening to the whole idea of like your focus shouldn't be on kind of in a way like reclaiming this position in the Fire Nation because you know how the rest of the world perceives the Fire Nation. It's like this is the wrong thing to do, especially because he doesn't know like his mother's full situation and that's not what she meant by this. Like what she meant was the stuff from like earlier in the flashbacks of like you, unlike your sister, unlike Ozai, like we don't throw stuff at like turtle ducks. Like we care when we find out someone in our family dies, that sort of thing. These kind of positive traits that you see Zuko had when he was younger that have kind of we've seen bits and pieces of them in the present day, like at the very start of this episode, that like he will not attack a pregnant woman to get his food and that sort of thing. He's better than that. Those are the kind of things that are more being like referred to here, but he doesn't quite get it, and that's what makes Azula and the Spirit Temple so interesting, is because they do the same thing with Azula at the end of that comic of like she does the full family announcement kind of type thing and takes a step backwards basically. So it's a cool section of the story, but you know that this is a bit of a like not sure about this one, Zuko, but what are your thoughts on this big Zuko moment here?
Yeah, no, that you make a good point there. It definitely feels like this is the wrong way to sort of out yourself in this sort of situation. But he's right now he is still, his proudness is still from the fact that he's from the Fire Nation, that he's from the royal family, and that's where he sees himself from in the most sort of positive light. Like he doesn't, he hasn't connected yet with sort of like his true sort of sense of character, his sense of worth. Like you said, we've seen like bits and pieces of it, but that's not necessarily where his mind is at right now. He's sort of, reflecting on his past, reflecting on the things that have sort of like brought him to this exact point, but not necessarily where, like you said, he needs to go in the future. So he's definitely, at least he gets the point across that he can be proud of, himself and like his upbringing overall. But he's, he himself doesn't quite have the sort of fuller picture yet of where he needs to be, or where his nation maybe needs to be in terms of the grand scheme of things. He's still more sort of self-reflective, self sort of important in terms of where he's at in this time in the world. But he's getting
Hmm.
there.
And then we go into flashback again. So he wakes up after having been woken up in the night by his mother leaving, and he's looking for Ursa, but only finds Azula. She says that their mother is gone, no one knows where she is, but also that Azulon passed away during the night as well. So something crazy happened this night, and the details no one really knows. She has also taken his knife. He does snatch it back, but they make the point of kind of highlighting that, like, you don't have mom to protect you anymore. You are going to have to kind of, things are going to change for you now going forward without her there for you. Um, and then we cut to the funeral for Azulon. It's a full like state funeral basically. Everyone's wearing like white. It's an interesting one with the looks. And yes, we get Ozai announced as the new Fire Lord as per Azulon's last wish, basically. Azula we see is delighted at this, but Zuko is sort of terrified at what this change means for him. He's just completely stunned at this sequence of events, and the episode then ends with present day Zuko just leaving the town alone again. But yeah, the flashback is the kind of key point here, of just like, oh, and Azulon also died that night. Okay, what happened here? Because I think there was always speculation about like, okay, well, connect the dots, and then especially later on in like book 3 when you get the whole your mother did like treasonous things that night, it's like, oh, is that the truth, Ozai, or not? And surprisingly, he kind of was telling the truth. So we eventually, I think, got to a reasonable place with knowing maybe a bit of a sense for what happened here, but not maybe the whys as such. Like, obviously, it's Zuko is alive. That was what Azulon was asked to do, so they got around that by killing the person who asked for Zuko to be killed, and then, as part of the deal, I guess, Ursa had to go as well. We'll get into the scene from the comic in just a second, but like, what are your thoughts on this one, kind of looking back on it now?
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's something missing, and that there's understanding of things that we don't sort of quite grasp. I think that was pretty clear even sort of back then, but I think knowing now sort of what sort of happened and sort of the back dealings that they had to go about in order for this situation to come out on top makes it a little bit more sort of like intriguing in terms of like knowing how Azulon really died and how that happened, and how Ozai really is sort of pushing forward with his own sort of like personal agendas, and how Azula is just sort of all for it, of course, at this point in time, the way that they have the sort of situation set up here. So it's definitely, I don't know, it's definitely interesting to see it from like the post perspective, especially understanding the comics and everything.
So yeah, well, let's get into that now. So continuing from the comic, like directly after she speaks to Azula and finds out basically, what did you hear? She immediately confronts Ozai and says, Ozai, you can't do this. He says, I have no choice. Refusing the Fire Lord's command is treason. But I'm a merciful man. I'm waiting until he's asleep. He won't feel a thing. And then Ursa gets very serious here and is like, you listen carefully. I'm going to make you a deal. You have nothing I want. You want the throne. Go on. I know how to make a poison that is colorless and odorless, completely untraceable. It causes a person to pass quietly, as if he'd simply fallen asleep. I'll give you a vial of it in exchange for Zuko's life. Once the poison is in your hands, you do whatever you wish. Ozai says, just where did you learn to concoct such a substance? My mother was a master herbalist. Very clever, dear wife, very clever. I accept your plan on one condition. Once we've made our exchange, you must leave the capital city and never show your face again. With you around, it's only a matter of time before a colorless, odorless poison is used against me, the new Fire Lord. Fine, but I take my children with me. No, the children are my collateral. As long as you keep your word, no harm will come to either of them. Should you try to stay or to take your children with you, however, I will hunt you all down, just like I did your precious boyfriend, referring to Ikem, of course, from the backstory. So that's basically what happened here. We then visually just get the idea of her using her herbalist skills from her mother to prepare the vial of odorless poison. She does hand it over to Ozai, so it's confirmed that, like, however Azulon died, he did it himself, like just using what Ursa gave him. And then we do get the additional scene here of just before she went in to speak to Zuko and kind of say goodbye to him. She did in fact go to basically say goodbye to Azula as well, but Azula didn't wake up when she went to kind of like kiss her on the cheek. So that's that whole situation. It's really interesting because obviously this adds this extra layer onto Ursa as a character, that this is directly, I think, relating to from earlier on in this episode, the whole idea of like mothers will do whatever they have to do to protect their children, and she kind of had to go to extremes here given the situation to save Zuko here, but she sort of facilitated the death of Azulon here, and that's what happened. The deal is, I suppose, roughly as you would expect. She tried to fight to take the kids with her, but he wanted them to keep them, to guarantee that she stays away. And then there's just the other element of like, oh, knowing that you can basically like assassination kill me whenever you want, I also don't want you around anymore, is a very interesting angle on it as well. But what are your thoughts on what the Search comic adds on to like revealing the truth of the story?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely, it's sort of, it feels like it's in place in terms of like, stuff that would happen in sort of like rural families and stuff like that, in terms of like, trying to come on top against, the other one and the different sort of situations. So it definitely feels like it's in place, in play in terms of like what would happen in this sort of family and this sort of situation here. And, I wonder what, sort of the alternative to this would have been more of like a direct confrontation, or would have Ozai even have really like cared in this sort of situation if, things would have gone sort of the other way for Zuko. I don't know, but the way that they go about it, it definitely feels like it plays right with what, they've sort of set up in the actual sort of show here. So, and we know they had this sort of like idea for it overall, for a while now. So it definitely was cool to actually get to see it actually like played out one for one, and to see, how much she cared for her children.
Yeah, and that is the kind of like the tragedy with Ursa, is that like she has to, from that point on, kind of like live on kind of knowing that like she's done this kind of sacrifice to protect her children, but can never really see them, because if Ozai ever discovers that she's in or around them, watching them, he'll go against the deal and hurt them. And the character that Ozai is, he will absolutely do it, because he basically said that he was just about to kill Zuko in his sleep. And it's just that kind of contrast of like, Zuko is about to die that night. Instead, he's woken up to his mother having to leave forever. It's just like this really kind of brutal kind of scene that, again, all started because Ozai asked for the birthright the day after Lu Ten died. Because I think it's an interesting sort of like what if of like, what if he just waited? Like, what would have actually happened if he had just waited a couple of months? Because I think Iroh is so broken up by what happens. Like, I don't think Ozai has to act that quickly. Like, it's maybe if he waits too long, Iroh comes back in and he becomes the Fire Lord. But I think there was time enough that maybe Azulon would have seen that, like, actually, I'm going to make that decision on my own in enough time, because Iroh's not going to have any more children, and I don't think he's like up to it anymore because he's been so affected by what happened. But what are your thoughts on that? Was Ozai just too hasty here, and it would have all kind of come his way anyway?
I don't know. That's definitely a good question to propose there, because I don't know. We always sort of consider that Ozai was sort of so broken up over this the death of her son Luten, right? And we can see that in other episodes, right? Like how much that really sort of meant to Ozai, and I don't know, that does, in terms of like what we know, right? That always seems like such a important part of like royal families to be able to continue the lineage in some sort of form or fashion, or there's some sort of like civil infighting within sort of the higher up families of whatever nation it is, right? Which of course that's something you never want to see, right? Like you don't want to see some form of like civil war in your own sort of nation, especially considering they're fighting a war with all the other nations, right? So they definitely probably want to avoid that. So it seems like they might have come to that conclusion on their own, or maybe Ozai could have like more subtly like implied that without being like directly implying that sort of thing, because it definitely feels like something that could have gone his way regardless, or he could have just taken another route to take out his sort of father as well. Like there's always so many other options and so many routes. This feels like a sort of forced hand situation that just sort of turned out for the best, almost for all characters, not for all of them of course, but yeah, it definitely feels like I don't know, it's just some situation where Ozai, like you said, he might have been a little bit too brash on this. I think he still probably should have or could have brought it up on his own later on, but maybe just not that soon.
Yep. I suppose we should probably address a bit of the kind of continuity stuff here, because during the funeral, the Fire Sage kind of gives the kind of eulogy type thing of like, Azulon, Fire Lord to our nation for 23 years, you are a fearless leader in the Battle of Garsai, our matchless conqueror of the Huzin provinces. You were father of Iroh, father of Ozai, husband of Ila, now past, grandfather of Luten, now past, grandfather of Zuko and Azula, we lay you to rest. You were the Fire Lord to our nation for 23 years is another one of these, what are you doing with the backstory, like generations and calculating time situation, because it's blatantly wrong, because it just doesn't make any sense, because Azulon is Sozin's son. So it's this weird situation where like they almost forgot about the 100-year gap or something like that here, because this would imply that Sozin lives to be like 150 or something like that, which just isn't the case. This got corrected in an interview with Avatar Spirit, like in like, what was it, 2007 here. It is one of these weird situations where, like, from the transcript of this interview, it's like they didn't know the information off the top of their heads, but they sent Avatar Spirit a kind of like addition, like, we went back and checked for you about this detailed thing. Brian says, I checked the timeline, and without giving too much away, here's a breakdown. Sozin actually ruled for about 20 years after he started the war, so he was about 82 when he started the war. Azulon, born shortly after the comet came, ruled for about 75 years and died at the age of 95. Ozai has only ruled for 5 years. They're the main milestones. So they say 23 here, it's actually 75. So the point here is that I get the impression they maybe didn't think enough about the timeline, and that Sozin was probably meant to have a child, and that child has a Zulon. There's basically, I think, meant to be an extra generation somewhere in the Fire Nation line to make it properly work out like nicely, but instead we have to have like some very like old characters having children, and I think it's the same with Ursa's family as well. It's a little bit unfortunate. It roughly works. But it's just funny how many like errors like this that they're off by quite a big margin there are, and this is why Kyoshi's 230 and all this sort of stuff. But I don't know. Any thoughts on that timelines?
No, that's funny. I mean, I don't know. I think when you're sort of creating these worlds and everything like that, like sometimes it's a bit sort of hard to keep the sort of scope of the world and the years and the history when you're doing it in sort of a episodic format in real sort of time here, and it helps to sort of go back and or take some breaks to sort of think of sort of the actual sort of timeline of things here. But it's funny that they do have that sort of correction and how things sort of worked out. But I mean, characters being older in this world, and I think we've sort of come to accept to some degree, especially considering, the bending and the powers and the abilities that they have. So some of it you can just sort of, write off to how sort of the world sort of functions, but it is sort of funny to see how that plays out
Hmm.
sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think the timing is also a bit interesting because like this interview is from like April 2007, so that's like pre-book three. So it does sort of imply that like the proper timeline of things was really only kind of like created in a way in relation to like book three content, because like we're nearly at the halfway point of like book two here, and they still maybe haven't like finalized some of
Mm.
that stuff. It's just an interesting one, but I think probably the last thing to mention, because like we mentioned it in news, is of course like it's so many years on from like the episode that like properly references Lieutenant, like how little we know about that character, and it seems like at some point later in this year we're actually going to properly learn some stuff about him, just like who he was as a character in his
Mhm, mhm.
RPG bio, because he's a legend NPC whenever we get it. Um, I'm very intrigued to see what way they kind of go with that, because obviously the death of Liu Ten kind of, that's what kind of creates the situation. If you track it back even further than the Ozai asking about it, it's his death causes an issue when it comes to the succession kind of thing in the Fire Nation. So, um, what are your thoughts on that, and sort of maybe any expectations or what you want from a Liu Ten bio? Given that I'm assuming it's not going to address his death, because it will be him during the era when he's alive. So it will be like about him and who he is.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't think I have any sort of big expectations from it. I think it'll be interesting to see, in their sort of description of him and, I guess how they sort of, frame it and stuff, like how he is as a character. Like, is he more like, sort of like an Iroh, or like, how Zuko sort of is, since, he considers him like a son, or is he more sort of like, pro Fire Nation sort of mentality sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to get sort of his, what little bits we can gather from his sort of like personality and character traits. I think that'll be interesting to see how they sort of describe that, and how, a lot of those bios are, sort of worked in conjunction with, the Avatar Studios, right? So that's more, sort of being official as well in terms of, as far as we know, for most of that stuff. So it'd be cool to see how that sort of plays out, and, how maybe that gets used in future media as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah, for me, like I think we have like a few things like where like the legacy of the Fire Nation. There's that image of like Iroh and Liu Ten like kind of just about to hug each other. So maybe any speculation that like there was like an issue between the two of them maybe isn't so much the case, because like the what does Iroh says, like I wish I could have helped you, and like what's the exact meaning of that? Does that mean he was troubled in some way, you disagreed, or was it just that I wasn't there during that kind of instance where you were killed? That's just that sort of regret from Iroh. It seems like no, they got on really well. So I'm I'm almost interested to see, will they kind of do something with Liu Ten and kind of be like, did he inspire Iroh to maybe do one of the big things in his life, in terms of like, did Liu Tin give him like clues maybe on where to find the Sun Warriors or something like that? Like, was there somehow some inspiration of like, what if we could redirect lightning, and maybe like there's a foundational thing that like an inspiration for the ability comes from his son in some way, and just something to add a little bit of like extra kind of bit onto it. But anything new at this point, I think, is interesting, just to know what's kind of going on, because it's been a long time, and I think it will help to just make those moments, the Tales of Bossing Say moments, all the more impactful when we actually know something about this character, and then not just be a plot point that like he died, as it kind of mostly is right now. And then also, yeah, it means we'll get, I suppose, a proper, super clean promo piece of art of Liu Ten as well, in kind of the Legends kind of show styles. That's going to be exciting as well. Because we don't have much art of Liu Ten either, and that's another point. But and then everyone's wondering as well, like I doubt they're going to do it, but like, who's his mother? Like that's a question that obviously comes up. Like, does it matter? why is it a mystery if it's not the case? What's going on there? But we'll just have to wait and see on that. But yeah, that's basically the podcast. It'll probably be a while maybe before we get back to the episode reviews, just because I'm assuming the next 2, maybe 3 podcasts will be discussing Netflix Avatar, because we do want to take our time going through that and not just try and do one mega podcast about the whole 8 hours. So it could be a decent bit before we get back to it, but when we do, there's obviously some exciting stuff as we get towards the middle of book 2 of Avatar, and we do the finale of book 2, so it is pretty exciting. But yeah, the next podcast probably will be in the maybe week or 2 following the release of Netflix Avatar. Again, we have to organize what specifically is going to happen, because I think it's going to be a bit of a crazy day the day it comes out, in terms of everyone rushing to watch it so they don't get spoiled and stuff like that. And I suppose that's the final question I suppose I have, is just like, what are your thoughts on that, in terms of like the whole binge watch aspect? Because we basically know it's going to be all 8 at once. What are your plans going to be for watching it?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I'll probably watch like a couple episodes a day over maybe sort of like the week that it's come out there, because I don't have to like report on it or anything like that. So I'll probably take it at least a little bit slow, but I can see the reason why many people would feel the need to sort of, consume it as fast as once if you're able to, because you might not have the time in the day in order to have it all go at once. But I can understand the reason behind trying to watch it all at once. But I think I'm going to at least try to pace myself over the course of the week, rather than try to like dump it in one day or one night or something like that.
Yeah, that's definitely my thing. I think I've definitely accepted that, like, okay, there's no way I'm doing like full coverage of this in one day. So yeah, it's probably going to be like a 2, maybe even 3-day thing, depending on like how exactly it goes and all that sort of stuff. But it's also one where I also realized that like it's probably a good thing as well to just like spread the coverage out a little bit, because we don't want to just talk about it for a week and then like we're done with that, and then like there's potentially like a 4-month gap with nothing to talk about until the comics and books come out. So there's that. But yeah, that's been episode 268 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.